The Best of Relations. A Pride and Prejudice variation by Catherine Bilson. Narrated by Catherine Bilson. Introduction. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a wise aunt is the best ally a girl can ever have. Considering the limited opportunities for socialising in early 1800s England and the fact that we know Mrs. Gardner maintained friends in Lambton, I found it incredible that she would not know of the Darcys and the Wickhams. Asking myself the question of, what if Mrs. Gardner warned the Bennets about Wickham, led to the decision to write this story. I hope you enjoy it. Prologue. Longbourn, 4th November, 1811. My dearest Aunt Gardner, I pray you will not reproach me for my dreadful tardiness in answering your last letter. We have been so busy here, some days I hardly know whether I am on my head or my heels. I shall start first with the most exciting news. Our dearest Jane is in love. Yes, Aunt, and with a very pleasing young gentleman by the name of Mr. Bingley, who has lately let Netherfield. We met him at the Meryton Assembly held some 3 weeks past, and, of course, being a young man of sense and discernment, he immediately perceived Jane to be quite the most beautiful young lady in the room, and spent the whole night staring at her, when he was not dancing with her. Their contact since then has only enhanced regard on both sides, I am pleased to say. Mamma, of course, imagines them married already, and can talk of nothing but carriages and pin money, for Mr. Bingley is quite wealthy. We are invited to Lucas Lodge tonight, and I hope to see Jane and Mr. Bingley together there. You know Jane. She does not like to express her feelings, but she has said to me that she thinks herself in very great danger of falling in love with him. I can only think it a good thing, for he is clearly already very much in love with her. Who could not be? He will suit her very well, I think, for he is as charming and cheerful as she, though rather more gregarious in company. The only fly in the ointment, or flies rather, are his two extremely supercilious sisters, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. They seem to think themselves very much above the company here in Meryton, which is abominably conceited of them. You know I am not a snob, dear aunt, but they have no call to lord it over the local gentry, wealthy though their brother may be, because their wealth derives from trade. Mr. Bingley has a friend visiting too, a Mr. Darcy, even richer than himself, who also seems to think himself well above the company. At the assembly he was quite shockingly rude to all, and insulted me particularly, though I found it in myself to laugh at him. I will recount for you here his words, aunt, and you shall see how my vanity was pricked. Mr. Bingley was pressing Mr. Darcy to dance, and pointed me out as a possible partner. Mr. Darcy declared me to be tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt him. How Charlotte and I giggled, but I was a little hurt, I must confess. Dear aunt, I pray you will not think ill of me for it, but even in comparison to Jane, I am not used to being so easily dismissed. I shall have my revenge, though. I understand the Netherfield party are invited to Lucas Lodge too, and I shall think up something cuttingly dismissive to say of Mr. Darcy in his hearing. And so I must conclude, for it is time for me to go and dress for the evening. I shall only end by saying I hope that you and dear uncle are most well, and all my dear cousins also. I faithfully promise not to leave it so long before responding when next I hear from you. Your loving niece, Lizzy. Gracechurch Street, November 10th, 1811. Dearest Lizzy, of course you are forgiven your tardiness in response. I did receive a letter from Jane in the interim, so I have not been wholly ignorant of news, though I am glad that you have enlightened me on her true feelings. She mentioned Mr. Bingley but once in her epistle, describing him as a pleasant new neighbour, though she waxed lyrical on the subject of his sisters, calling them new and dear friends. I doubt not that your descriptions are more apt, because we all know that dearest Jane is a little too inclined to think the best of everybody. Safeguard her heart, Lizzy. I should not like to see her hurt. I shall hope for the best, and an invitation soon to a wedding. We are all well here. Emily has had a slight cold, but is well recovered. She practises on the pianoforte without having to be told, and speaks incessantly of visiting at Christmas, when you may give her some more lessons, if you will be so good. I think you will be delighted. She is coming on well and developing a pretty singing voice, if you will believe her proud mamma. Thomas and Lily are also well. Thomas has been breeched now, and looks a fine young gentleman. He is coming along well with his letters and numbers. Anna was just taking her first steps when we saw you last spring, and now she runs everywhere. A most energetic little girl. I think perhaps she will inherit your love of long walks. A note on your walks, dear Lizzy. Jane mentioned that the Shire militia are lately encamped in Meryton. I must caution you that there may be rough fellows among those ranks, and perhaps it might not be wise for you to walk quite so much alone off Longbourn's acres. Even accompanied by your sisters, if you should come across a group of men in drink in some isolated spot, it might not go well for you. I seek not to frighten you, dearest niece, but you must know that there is wickedness in this world. And despite what Mr. Bingley's friends said of you, you and all of your sisters are more than handsome enough to tempt any man. That was very rude of Mr. Darcy to speak so. Obviously it cannot be the Mr. Darcy I know, a very fine gentleman who owns the estate of Pemberley in Derbyshire. Pemberley is but 5 miles from Lambton, where I grew up. I am sure I have told you about it many times. And though Mr. Darcy is, I suppose, of an age to be friends with Jane's Mr. Bingley, and certainly does not balk at friends in trade, he dines with us quite often when he is in town, I cannot imagine him ever being so rude to any young lady. Repine not upon the words of an uncivilized fool, dearest Lizzy. You are beautiful, and I have seen for myself how the young men flock about you at dances. And try not to be directly rude to anyone, though I confess I shall have a few quiet chuckles when you tell me what set down you thought up to deliver in Mr. Darcy's hearing at the Lucas party. Anna will be awakening from her nap shortly and wanting me, so I shall finish by saying that I hope that all are well at Longbourn, and that your uncle and I look forward very much to seeing you all at Christmas time. If you would be so kind as to let your mother know that we expect to travel to you on Monday 23rd, and stay for 1 week. We are invited to a very grand party at an important acquaintance's home on New Year's Eve, and your uncle and I would rather not miss it. I have ordered a very glamorous new dress for the occasion, and though I would not want to crush it bringing it with me, I shall endeavour to sketch it for you. All my love as always. Your loving Aunt Madeline. Longbourn, Sunday, November 17th. Dearest Aunt, I have just today returned to Longbourn and received your letter. Yes, I have been away, though I gave no notice of it in my last missive. Be not alarmed by what I am about to relate, for all is well now, but Jane was taken very ill when dining with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley at Netherfield last Tuesday, and I have been there nursing her back to health. She is now very much recovered from a nasty cold, and is quite herself again, and I must tell you that I think Mr. Bingley to be more in love with her than ever. I do not doubt that we shall find him upon Longbourn's doorstep in a day or so, inquiring for her health. I am very glad that Emily too has recovered from her cold. I hope that no one else caught it, most especially you, dear aunt. Well do I know how you will not put yourself first, even when you are unwell. I beg that if you do by some mischance become ill, send for myself or Jane at once. We will gladly come, and take as much burden as we may from your shoulders, that you may recover as quickly as may be. And pray tell Emily that I look forward very much to hearing her play and sing. Soon I am sure she will be far beyond any improvement a lesson from myself may offer. How I wish Christmas time would hurry, so that we shall see you all again. Kiss Thomas, Lily, and Anna for me too. That is, if Thomas does not think himself too big for kisses now, of course. Dearest Aunt, there is one part of your letter that puzzles me exceedingly. The Mr Darcy with whom you are acquainted must be the very same that is at Netherfield with Mr Bingley. There cannot possibly be two estates named Pemberley in Derbyshire, owned by a Mr Darcy, surely. Yet I find him far too proud to associate with anybody in Hertfordshire. He looks at me only to find fault and criticise everything I say. Perhaps he has spent too much time with Miss Bingley, who is most determined to find favour in his eyes. Every word out of Miss Bingley's mouth shows that she thinks herself far above our company and cannot wait to be away from here. She would separate her brother from Jane if she could, but I do not think that he will listen. Perhaps I shall tease Mr Darcy further by claiming you and my uncle as a mutual acquaintance. Do you think that he will confess it in front of Miss Bingley? She knows that we have relatives in Cheapside, and is most condescending about it. I will admit that Mr Darcy seems a very intelligent man. Every time I am in his company, we end up sparring verbally, and he does hold up his end of the argument. He accused me, though, of espousing opinions not my own deliberately to create dissent. Just imagine. Your warning about the militia is taken to heart, dearest aunt. Kitty and Lydia's heads have been filled with nothing but officers and flirtation ever since they came here, and I must say the officers do seem to be pleasant, gentlemanly fellows, but of course the soldiers of the rank and file may be somewhat uncouth. The weather is turning cold, and we have had 1 or 2 wet days, which have curtailed my walks anyway, but I shall be sure to stay only to well-travelled roads when I walk, whether alone or with my sisters, and I shall caution them to do likewise. We are all well here at Longbourn, now that Jane is recovered and we are both home. Mr Bingley has spoken of giving a ball at Netherfield Park, so we are all a-twitter. Jane has a new gown in white and gold. She looks like an angel, of course. I teased her that we should make goose-feather wings to complete the picture, and she blushed most fiercely. I heard Mr Bingley describe her as an angel in company once, and I have wondered if he has whispered it to her directly to make her blush so. Jane tells me everything usually, but she has never been in love before. Well, I must allow her some secrets. I am remaking my blue gown with some new ribbons and that lovely piece of lace you sent me for my birthday to trim the neckline. I had been saving it for a special occasion, and this might be such, if Mr Bingley only does as we hope. But no more of that. I shall begin to sound like Mamma on the subject. I did of course advise her of your travel plans, dear aunt, and we shall all be very glad to see you, though sorry you can stay no longer than a week. Pray tell me more of this event on New Year's Eve, and describe your special gown, or at least include your sketch with your next letter. I am all agog. Well, I have just about crossed the page completely, and so I shall say adieu. Your loving niece, Lizzy. Gracechurch Street, November 20th, 1811. Dearest Lizzy, I shall write this quickly because I want to send it out by return post. We are all well here, and I am glad to hear that Jane is recovered. Lizzy, I am exceedingly confused by your account of Mr Darcy. Can there be some misunderstanding? He is the very best of men. I have known him since his birth. He is but 3 years my junior. Indeed, he is a very distant cousin of mine. The solicitor's business in Lambton, which my father owned, was begun by the present Mr Darcy's great-grandfather as a gift to his youngest son. My grandmother was that junior scion's daughter, and the business has remained in our family since. Mr Darcy and his father have been the most gracious masters of Pemberley estate, which I will tell you, if you do not already know, is one of the greatest in the country. The Darcy family own near half of Derbyshire, and land in a good many other counties besides, and I do not know anyone who will not call them the very finest of masters. But in addition to that, both your uncle and I know Mr Darcy well personally. He is a partner in Gardner Imports, and having shown your last 2 letters to your uncle, he informs me that he has dealt a number of times on excellent terms with Mr Bingley too. I must beg of you not to antagonize Mr Darcy, and if you have not already mentioned your familial connection with us, pray do not do so in any manner that might be deemed disrespectful to him. I must go to take this to the post. I pray you are all well at Longbourn. Your loving Aunt Madeline. Longbourn, 23rd November. Dearest Aunt, you have only succeeded in confusing me further. I have met another old acquaintance of Mr Darcy, who has nothing good to say of him at all. Indeed, his words have only confirmed my initial, and lately reinforced, impressions of the man. I speak of a Mr Wickham, the son of the late steward at Pemberley, to whom the late Mr Darcy promised a living in his will. The current Mr Darcy refused to honour the bequest. Shocking behaviour, and to a young man with much to recommend him, who is lowered to having to take a commission in the militia to support himself. Do you know Mr Wickham also? We have lately met him, and I must say I have found him quite charming. I am afraid that your friend Mr Darcy, and distant relative, hard though it is to believe that such a man can be related to someone as good and kind as yourself, must show 2 faces to the world, one to those he considers to be worthy of his regard, and quite another to those he does not. But enough of that disagreeable man. I must relate to you a tale of yet another amusing gentleman. What do you think? Our cousin Mr Collins has come to visit. It is he, of course, upon whom Longbourn is entailed upon Papa's passing. He wrote Papa a letter, and abides with us until the end of the month. I cannot think him a sensible gentleman, although he is a clergyman at a parish called Hunsford in Kent. He speaks little of the Lord's word, but a great deal about the words of his patroness, a Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who to me sounds like a most ghastly, interfering, managing woman. Most unfortunately, our cousin seems to think that he should present an olive branch to make up for the regrettable circumstances that will see him inherit Longbourn one day, and he seems to think that said olive branch should consist of his selecting a bride from among my father's daughters. Jane was fortunately exempt from his ghastly attentions, as Mamma very strongly hinted that she would be likely shortly engaged, but this has only caused him to set his sights upon me. Oh dear, Aunt, I am caught in a most awkward situation. I would by no means cause grief to any member of my family, but Mamma is doing her very best to press Mr Collins on me, and I cannot abide him. I cannot like him, I cannot respect him, and the thought of being his wife makes me ill to my stomach. I pray that I can divert him from asking me, and that if he should be too obtuse to take the hint, that my father will not force me to accept him. I cannot think that Papa ever would, for he too makes it clear that he thinks Mr Collins a buffoon, but then Mamma. Well, I shall cross that bridge when I come to it, and in the meantime rely upon you, dear Aunt. Perhaps you can provide me with a hint or two for discouraging unwanted suitors. I recall Uncle laughingly saying that the young men of Derbyshire all broke their hearts over you when he stole you away. We are all well here, though the miserable weather keeps us pent indoors. I am grateful for the obligation to return your letter, dear Aunt, as it means I have an excellent excuse to avoid being Mr Collins' company for an hour. Forgive me. It is never a chore to write to you. I hope that you are all well in Gracechurch Street, and look forward with ever greater anticipation to seeing you at Christmas time. Your loving niece, Lizzy. Chapter 1. Monday, 25th November, 1811. The dinner party at Longbourn was interrupted and greatly surprised by the delivery of an express from London in Mrs. Gardiner's hand, addressed to Mr. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet promptly had a fit of nerves, imagining her brother taken ill, but Mr. Bennet quickly reassured her, frowning over the unfolded letter. "Let the rider go, Hill. There is no need of a reply," he told Mrs. Hill, waiting by the door, and when she had closed the door, he looked around the table until his eye lit upon Elizabeth. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, still looking at his second daughter, "I pray you prepare for another guest. Our sister Mrs. Gardner will be with us before noon tomorrow. Elizabeth, I will see you in my book-room once you have finished your meal." "Yes, sir," Lizzy replied, her brow furrowed with confusion, thinking back over her last letter to Mrs. Gardner. What could she have said that might have provoked such a drastic response? "And myself, Mr. Bennet." Mr. Collins gulped down the mouthful he was chomping on and half rose. "Why would I need to see you, Mr. Collins?" Mr. Bennet, risen from his chair and half-way to the door, turned and looked at his cousin. "Well, if it is an urgent matter concerning my dearest cousin Elizabeth, then it must necessarily concern me as well." He gave an awkward half-bow and a smirk in Elizabeth's direction. She sought not to look at him, and satisfied herself by glaring at Kitty and Lydia, who had immediately started giggling at this pronouncement. "The matter does not concern Elizabeth, sir. I merely wish to consult with her about it." Mr. Bennet gave Mr. Collins a glare. "Should I require your counsel on the matter, rest assured that I will ask for it in due course." He exited the room, closing the door firmly behind him. Elizabeth found that she had quite lost her appetite. Ignoring Lydia's impertinent questions directed at her as to what on earth was going on, she took a last sip of her tea, laid down her napkin, and quietly excused herself to attend her father. She found him in his book-room, staring out into the darkening sky as the rain poured down. The door had been left open for her, so she slipped in and closed it softly. "Papa," she said quietly, "you wished to see me?" "I am just hoping that you can shed some light on this matter for me, Lizzy, my dear." He turned about and smiled at her, gesturing to his desk. She saw then that the unfolded letter lay upon it. Read it, and then perhaps you can explain what your aunt is about." Lizzy looked from her cheerfully smiling father to the letter and back again. It could not be an urgent or serious matter anyway, she reasoned. Her father looked as though he expected to be highly diverted. She picked up the letter and moved closer to the candle on the desk to read it. Gracechurch Street, Monday, 25th November. My dear brother Bennet, first allow me to assure you that all is well here, as I know that will be Fanny's first fear. Secondly, I must beg your indulgence and wait upon you all myself at Longbourn tomorrow morning. I should be with you before noon. Edward is sending me in his carriage with Mr. Jameson and my maid to attend me. I hope to be with you only a day or two before returning to London. I cannot set this all out on paper. If I could, I should have written a letter, but I can only say that I have received news from Lizzy of a most serious nature, though she cannot possibly know it. I will explain all when I am with you, but for now please indulge me by ensuring that no member of your family has any contact with the militia officer, Mr. Wickham. Madeline Gardner. Elizabeth read the note through twice, fairly gaping at it. Then she set it down on the desk and looked at her father in confusion.
"I see from your expression that you have no more idea what this means than I do, Lizzy," Mr. Bennet said dryly. "Your aunt says herself that you cannot possibly know what news you communicated to her. Something regarding this Mr. Wickham. I have heard that name giggled by Lydia and Kitty these last couple of days, but I did not think it had passed your lips."
"I have met the gentleman, sir." Lizzy sat down in the seat her father waved her to, and he took his own comfortable chair beside her. "I am sure you did hear me speak of him. Were you not there when we talked of Mr. Darcy denying him the living?"
"Ah, so that was the man. Well, he must be a Derbyshire man, then. Perhaps your aunt knows something of him that we do not. I will abide by her word. Not that it will cost me anything, I suppose, for we do not go out tonight. Tomorrow the rain might clear, but no doubt you will all be readying for the ball. I shall merely issue an edict that none may go into Meryton, that any ribbons required will have to be selected from those already in the house, and we shall have no danger of encountering Mr. Wickham until after your aunt arrives."
Elizabeth agreed, trying hard to think of what exactly she had said in her last letter. "Papa," she said after a moment, "Mr. Wickham was not the only new acquaintance I mentioned in my last letter. I also told her of Mr. Collins' visit, and, of his attentions to me." Mr. Bennet, in the process of picking up his book, looked at her over his glasses.
"He has not made any, untoward advances, has he, Lizzy?" he asked in a suddenly serious tone.
"Only unwanted ones, nothing that could breach the bounds of propriety," Elizabeth said, and her father's kindly, amused smile encouraged her to say, "You would not make me marry him, would you, papa?"
"I would not permit that bumbling buffoon to marry any one of my daughters for the sake of 20 Longbourns, Lizzy, and most especially not yourself. Do not for a moment consider it. Your mother may be convinced you will all starve in the hedgerows, but I for one have every confidence that I will live to see all of you girls comfortably settled. And be assured that your mother knows very well her situation is not so dire as all that. Her £5,000 to be divided equally among you all upon her demise. The proceeds from the investment of those moneys in the funds have been piling up nicely for quite some years, and will be more than enough to see her comfortably settled, should she and her nerves outlive me. Last year, your Uncle Phillips assisted me in buying 2 cottages in Hatfield with some of those proceeds. They are tenanted, and the rental income is reinvested. Either one of those would provide a good home for her, and the rent from the other would ensure her table was never bare. So do not worry about your mother."
"Does she know about this?" Elizabeth said, her mouth agape.
"Of course she knows."
Mr. Bennet snorted.
"But I am afraid that your mother looks upon herself as the foremost hostess of the neighbourhood, being mistress of Longbourn, and losing that prestigious title would be rather offensive. Consequently, she seeks to improve the status of us all by marrying you girls off well. Seeing one of you as Mrs. Collins would ensure she never had to leave Longbourn, would it not?"
He lifted his book again.
"I have no concerns about Mr. Collins, my dear, and your aunt and uncle know very well that none of you need marry for anything other than affection. Now, off with you. And if you can find it in you to tolerate the fool a little better, knowing that you most certainly will not be made to marry him, I pray you could keep him in the parlour with you for a while, and leave your poor old papa in peace with his book."
Impulsively, Elizabeth jumped to her feet, stooped, and kissed his grizzled cheek. "I shall gladly tolerate him with such knowledge, papa. Enjoy your book, and I shall do my best to ensure that you are left in peace." Mr. Bennet smiled, watching her leave the room with a spring in her step. He glanced at the letter on the desk, frowned slightly, and then dismissed it from his mind. He would know soon enough what all the to-do was about. Mrs. Bennet at once pressed Elizabeth for answers when she entered the parlour, but she could only shake her head and say that her aunt's letter had left her none the wiser as to what the urgency might be. Jane gave her an expressive glance, but Elizabeth shrugged her shoulders minutely in response. Hugging her father's assurances close, she tolerated Mr. Collins's officious attentions for the rest of the evening in patient acquiescence, for once pleasing her mother, who smiled and smirked happily at her. It was almost bedtime when Mrs. Bennet started up out of her chair with a look of alarm, and dashed, without a word, off to the book-room. Her daughters looked at each other in bemusement, and even more so when both of their parents came out 5 minutes later, Mr. Bennet with an envelope in hand, and a long-suffering expression on his face. He was heard sending Mr. Hill to summon Adams, the groom, and a few minutes later Mrs. Bennet re-entered the parlour with a satisfied smile. "Lord, mamma, what was all that about?" Typically, it was Lydia who asked.
"Young ladies need not demand to know all the business of their elders and betters," Mr. Collins said with a sniff, but Mrs. Bennet ignored him and answered her youngest daughter. "Why, the ball tomorrow night, of course, Lydia. We could not have your Aunt Gardner sitting at home. Adams will ride down to London tonight and ensure that she brings a suitable gown with her." "But she has not been invited," Mary proclaimed at once. Mrs. Bennet dismissed that with a wave of her hand. "Goodness, that is of no importance. We shall send a note around in the morning. Jane may write to Miss Bingley, advising of my sister's unexpected arrival. One more guest among more than 100 will make no difference, I am sure, and we may use my brother's carriage to convey us as well as our own." Jane looked a little uncomfortable about the imposition, but agreed. "I hope Adams will be all right in this dreadful weather, riding all the way to London," she said in her soft voice. "He has all night to get there, and it is only just above 20 miles to Gracechurch Street," Elizabeth comforted her. "He need not go above a walk, and I am sure he will wrap up well. Hark! I think the rain might even have stopped." They all fell silent, listening, and one by one agreed. Finally, the succession of rain had indeed stopped. "Hooray!" cried Lydia. "We can walk into Meryton in the morning. I must have new shoe roses, and perhaps we will see some of the officers. I did hope that Denny or Wickham might ask me for the first dance." "You will not be walking anywhere with this mud," cried Mrs. Bennet. "Not a chance. You shall catch your death of cold, and who will dance with you then? No, those shoe roses Kitty made for you will do very well, and as for the officers, I doubt not that they will all be queuing up to dance with you the moment you step from the carriage, darling, lively girl that you are. No, off to bed with all of you now. Get your sleep, so that you will look bright and fresh for tomorrow." Chapter 2. Elizabeth slept poorly and woke little refreshed. Looking out of her window at a sky still grey and cast over with clouds, she hoped it would not rain further and delay her aunt's arrival at Longbourn. But before that there was a great deal to do. She and Jane had some little needlework details to finish on Jane's gown, and then they intended to bathe and dress each other's hair before the ball. They had best get started, and so she leaned over to the other side of the bed and gently shook her sister awake. According to her good nature, Jane awoke with a smile on her lips, and was much amenable to getting started on their preparations straight away, so they should be ready before their aunt's arrival. It also kept them sequestered from Mr. Collins, who could be heard stumping around the house, cranky because he could not spend the morning paying fatuous compliments to Elizabeth, and out of the way of Kitty and Lydia, who spent the morning bickering as usual. Mary shut herself in the music-room, and could be heard plunking away at the pianoforte, practising some dirge
she no doubt hoped to exhibit that evening. Elizabeth could only hope devoutly that she would not be given the opportunity. Elizabeth had just finished untying the last of the curl rags from Jane's golden hair. Her own dark locks were curly enough not to need them, when they heard the sound of carriage wheels outside. "Our aunt is here!" And they were both scrambling up from the cushions where they had been sitting before the fire. Downstairs they rushed, and were just in time to see their aunt walk into the hallway. "Aunt Madeline!" "Dear Jane! Dear Lizzy!" She opened her arms to them, and they threw themselves against her, much as they had been doing for the last 10 years since she married their uncle. She had very rapidly become their favourite aunt, wise and kind. "My dear girls, what a pleasure to see you!"
"Sister," Mr. Bennet's voice came dryly from the doorway to his book room. "A pleasure indeed, though unlooked for until last night. Can your urgent business wait until after you have settled in, or must we speak now?"
"It can wait, Brother Bennet." She smiled, walked over, and kissed his cheek. "You look well."
"As do you."
He smiled at her fondly.
"Edward is well? The children?"
"Very well."
"Well, Jane and Lizzy will make you comfortable, I am sure, and I shall be here when you are ready."
He gave her a slight bow and left her to his daughters. "Mamma is just at her bath, Aunt, but allow us to show you upstairs. Oh, Adams!" Jane saw the young groom enter, carrying a trunk. "You got to London in time and safely, then?"
"Yes, Miss Bennet. Thank you, Miss Bennet."
He flushed and tugged at his forelock. "Indeed he did. And yes, I have brought my new gown with me, though I cannot think it was quite so urgent to set that poor young man on the road all night. He will be quite exhausted. The note said I should attend the ball with you." Mrs. Gardner looked at her nieces. "Yes, Aunt. I sent a note to Miss Bingley this morning, and the response came not an hour hence, that we should of course be welcome to bring any relative of ours," Jane soothed. "Oh, good. I would not impose for the world. Now I know your cousin Mr. Collins is occupying the guest room. Where am I to sleep? I could share with one of you girls." "Certainly not," Jane and Elizabeth both chorused. "Jane shares with me, and you have her room. We made it up with fresh linen last night, and Hill lit the fire first thing this morning. It should be lovely and snug, and we will have Sarah bring up warm water directly for you to refresh yourself, and tea." "Good. And then you must come with me to your father, and we shall talk, Lizzy," Mrs. Gardner said, rather ominously. Jane looked at Elizabeth with eyebrows raised, but Elizabeth could only shrug her shoulders, her eyes wide with confusion. "I beg that you will tap on my door when you are ready for me, Aunt," was all she could say, and then they were at the door to Jane's room. "I shall call Sarah to attend to you now." "I should think half an hour, Lizzy," was Mrs. Gardner's parting remark. Of course, half an hour stretched into a great deal longer once Mrs. Bennet realised her sister by marriage had arrived. She made a great fuss, demanding to know what disaster had befallen her brother, or her nephew or nieces in London. It took Mrs. Gardner a good while to soothe her, all the while fending off impertinent and silly questions from Lydia and Kitty respectively. And then, once they had managed to extricate themselves, Mrs. Gardner and Elizabeth encountered Mr. Collins in the hallway downstairs. Of course he had to be introduced, and spent a good 10 minutes making fatuous remarks, bowing in Elizabeth's direction every few moments, as Mrs. Gardner watched with a sardonic eye and glanced at Elizabeth often, smiling slightly. Mr. Collins even attempted to enter the book-room with them, but was firmly and not too politely evicted by Mr. Bennet, who declared that he had not been invited to this particular, private discussion, and as such could wait along with the rest of the family for any results he might care to disseminate. "Good Lord!" Mrs. Gardner sank into a chair, smiling at her brother-in-law and her niece. "Tell me you shan't let Lizzy marry that idiot, Thomas."
"I have already advised Lizzy of that fact," Mr. Bennet said with a smile, "and I am only hoping that the buffoon has the decency to propose to her within earshot, so that I may be amused by the setting down she shall give him."
"Papa, that is cruel," Elizabeth admonished. "He may be a fool, but he is a decent man who means well. I should take no pleasure in being forced to reject him, and I would far rather you made it clear to him beforehand that his suit would not be accepted. I have certainly done my best to do so, but I do not think he has heard a word I have said. Perhaps he might listen to you." "Well said, Lizzy," Mrs. Gardner approved.
"Oh, you are spoiling all of my diversion."
Mr. Bennet sighed.
"Very well, I shall have a word with him tomorrow, I dare say. For now, Madeline, why don't you enlighten us on what all this to-do is about? Because Lizzy seems to not have the faintest idea. She was just as bemused by your note as I."
He glanced at the sideboard.
"May I pour you a sherry?"
"Do you know, I think I will. I was quite overset yesterday when I received Lizzy's letter, and I declare I slept not a wink last night." Mrs. Gardner accepted the small glass of sherry Mr. Bennet pressed upon her, sat back, and made herself comfortable, while Mr. Bennet poured himself a glass of brandy, and seated himself also. Lizzy perched on a stool, gazing at her aunt in confusion. "Dear aunt," she said, "I have not the faintest idea what I could have said to make you rush here so precipitately. Our opinions of Mr. Darcy seem to be most peculiarly at odds, but that could not make you react so drastically, surely. And in your note you mentioned Mr. Wickham." "Wickham!" Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's mild-mannered, sweet aunt, fairly spat the name. "Elizabeth, that man is scum!" "Aunt Gardiner!" Wide-eyed, Elizabeth stared. "Pray, whatever can you mean?" The tale her aunt told then shocked both Elizabeth and her father utterly. As a young girl growing up in Lambton, Madeline Thompson, for that was her maiden name, enjoyed an enviable position as the daughter of the local solicitor. Distantly connected to, and under the patronage of the Darcys of Pemberley, the Thompsons were one of the foremost families of the district, despite not being strictly gentlefolk. They were invited everywhere, and Madeline had been admired by not a few of the well-born young gentlemen of the area. As was her sister, Louise.
"You have a sister?"
Mr. Bennet interrupted, astonished.
"I did not know."
"She is dead," Mrs. Gardner said grimly. "Dead these 11 years. Louise was 5 years younger than her sister, a blossoming beauty of 15, when she came to the notice of Mr. Wickham. He was attending his first year at Cambridge, and came home for the Easter holidays. The young Mr. Darcy had gone to visit his aunt in Kent, and Mr. Darcy the elder was unwell, the first hints of the illness that would take his life 4 years later laying him low. Mr. Wickham, bored and in want of diversion, turned his sights on Miss Louise Thompson. She, dazzled by his good looks and charm, allowed herself to be entranced. Believed his whispers that they would be married as soon as he finished his studies. "And then the holidays ended," Madeline said bitterly, "and he was off back to Cambridge." Elizabeth and her father looked at each other, and then back at Mrs. Gardner.
"Well, this does not sound so very wicked," Mr. Bennet said slowly. "Rather a case of young love that had no time to blossom."
"Oh, it blossomed all right," Madeline said, and then, to their mutual horror, she raised her hand and described with it an arc above her belly. "No!" Elizabeth gasped. Oh, yes. Louise Thompson was with child,
and when the unworldly young girl realised what had happened to her, several months on, who else could she confide in but her beloved big sister? By then, the summer holidays had come and gone too, Wickham and his promises with them, and Louise finally understood that the plumping of her belly was not due to eating too many sweetmeats. At first, Louise was convinced it would be all right, that her lover would come directly home and marry her, and she managed to convince Madeline of that as well. But by the time October came around, Louise's swelling belly was getting too hard to conceal, and her letters to Cambridge went unanswered. Madeline gathered up her courage and went to Pemberley. Mr. Wickham Senior was dead by then, but it was known that Mr. Darcy was the younger man's godfather. He would ensure Wickham married Louise, and everything would be all right. Mr. Darcy Senior, though, was not at Pemberley. He was in London. Having known Mrs. Reynolds for many years, Madeline asked to speak to her privately and poured out Louise's tale. Disapproving but sympathetic, Mrs. Reynolds promised to write to the master. But before a response could be had, Louise went into labour, Madeline concluded. She was more than 2 months before her time. The distress and the worry caused it, the doctor believed, and the fact that she was carrying twins. Neither my sister nor her daughters survived the birth. She died in my arms, still believing that her dear Wickham would come for her. Elizabeth was wide-eyed with shock. Mr. Bennet, older and a man of the world, sat back, thought for a moment and said, "Mrs. Gardner, this is a shocking tale, but it is a story of a young man of but 18 or so. I do not doubt he was most regretful." "He denied it all," Mrs. Gardner said flatly. When informed of the date of Louise's lying in, he claimed that he could not possibly have been the father, because he had been at Cambridge around the dates she had to have conceived. She was not even 7 months along, but it was twins, and they were big. Everyone thought her further along than she was, and so Wickham managed to convince the elder Mr. Darcy that Louise had lied. No one had ever seen them together. I had no inkling of it until she told me, but my sister was no liar. She had no reason to lie. Any other man would have married her in a minute, and my father would have seen them well set up. As it was, the shock killed him. He died, I am convinced, of a broken heart, not a month after Louise, and I went to Oxford to stay with my brother while he finished his studies, which is where I met my dear Edward. She went on to tell them that her reputation had been destroyed along with Louise's in Lambton, but there were still a few faithful friends there who maintained correspondence with her. One of those friends had told the younger Mr. Darcy of Louise and Wickham after he inherited Pemberley, and a year or so after that he had come to visit the Gardners in London. He told Mrs. Gardner that he did not doubt her story for a moment, that Wickham had been just as wild in his behaviour at Cambridge, and offered his sincere condolences for her sister's death. "He told me that his father had wanted Wickham preferred to the living at Kimpton," Mrs. Gardner said, "and upon seeing my reaction, told me most emphatically that he was well aware Wickham should never be a churchman, and that he had paid him the value of the living, in some thousands of pounds instead, and that Wickham had signed away those rights." Elizabeth gasped. So Mr. Darcy had denied Wickham the living. But thousands of pounds paid in recompense was no small thing, and a man who could behave so disgracefully should indeed never have care of a congregation. "Well, I have never met this Wickham." Mr. Bennet broke the silence that fell after Mrs. Gardner had finished speaking. "But I could not doubt you, Madeline, not after your sister's dreadful tale. I am so very sorry. You never told us." "It was such a scandal." Madeline touched her handkerchief to her eyes. "I told Edward, of course, but after getting to know Fanny, forgive me, but I suspected that she would find the tale too good not to share." Quite right. And it shall not leave this room, shall it, Lizzy? I believe that Mr. Wickham should be exposed. I cannot leave my neighbours' daughters vulnerable to such a man any more than my own. But we need only say that it was a young lady of your acquaintance in your youth that was so meanly used.
Mrs. Gardner agreed, turning to Elizabeth. Lizzy, my dear, I am sorry to disillusion you. I know how you pride yourself upon your discernment. But Mr. Wickham is possessed of a handsome face and the most charming manners, and he has many years of practice in dissembling. I could not possibly take the risk that you or one of your sisters might be taken in by him. It was such a shock to read his name in your letter, I hardly knew what I was about, only that I must get to you as quickly as possible. I had such a premonition of disaster. Oh, my dear aunt! Elizabeth knelt at her aunt's feet and took her hands. Thank you. You have shocked me greatly, but I am not so fixed in belief of my own superiority of understanding as to resent your guiding knowledge. It is a grievous shock indeed to discover that any supposed gentleman could be capable of such duplicitous behaviour. But as you said in your earlier letter, there is wickedness in this world, and we should be silly indeed to think that it might never touch us. With your permission, I will call all of my sisters and my mother downstairs, and you can share with them your knowledge of Mr. Wickham, without, of course, disclosing your sister's identity. Rest assured that I shall never tell even Jane. She will be shocked to the core as it is, for she never likes to think ill of anyone.
Yes, yes, Lizzy. Go and tell your sisters and your mother that your aunt would like to speak to them in the parlour. And if you send Mr. Collins to me, I shall sacrifice a half-hour of my time to keep the bumbling idiot out of the way.
Mr. Bennet sent Elizabeth on her way and reached for the sherry.
I'd better top up your glass, Madeline. You have been very brave.
Chapter 3. For several long minutes after Mrs. Gardner finished speaking, the only sound in Longbourn's parlour was the loud tick of the clock on the mantel. And then Jane fainted dead away on Elizabeth's shoulder. Lydia jumped to her feet and began to abuse her aunt, declaring that it could not possibly be the same Mr. Wickham, and from Mrs. Bennet came a low wail that gradually escalated into a full-blown fit of hysterics. Elizabeth closed her ears to her mother's wails and set about trying to gently rouse Jane. "Be silent for a few minutes at least, Lydia," she snapped as Lydia spoke louder, seeing that no one was paying her any attention. "You may display your ignorance when the rest of us have some leisure to hear it." Mrs. Gardner threw Elizabeth a look at the same time grateful and reproachful, and she turned her face away and attended to Jane. While she had assured her aunt truthfully that she was not resentful of guidance, it was still an unpalatable fact that her vaunted judgment of character had failed her woefully in at least one case. There had been no time yet for Mrs. Gardner to speak much of Mr. Darcy's character, and rather childishly, Elizabeth did not want to hear it. She acknowledged her own fault, but it is a hard thing to be told that you are wrong. Once in one day was surely enough. Approaching Netherfield that evening, Elizabeth still felt herself to be in rather a state of shock. The afternoon had passed away rapidly while settling Mrs. Bennet's hysterics and seeing to Jane, who was perhaps even more upset than her mother. Jane had never wanted to believe that such wickedness could exist in the world, much less be possessed by one man, and of their acquaintance. Lydia had defiantly refused to believe Mrs. Gardner's account of Wickham's character, and in the end her father had been summoned, declared her a silly child, and withdrawn his permission for her to attend the Netherfield ball. All her tears and pleas fell on deaf ears, and she was left at home with Mrs. Hill. For once, Mrs. Bennet had not attempted to change her husband's mind with regards to a firmer hand with her favourite. "Silly child," she said, fluttering her handkerchief. It is hard enough to recognise a man of poor character, but when a girl is foolish enough to disbelieve a reliable account, she has a very great deal still to learn. No, indeed, best she stay at home and reflect upon her behaviour. If this Mr. Wickham has the nerve to show his face at the ball, no doubt she would be silly enough to still want to be acquainted with the scoundrel. I assure you, I shall not give him countenance. I very much doubt that Mr. Wickham would dare to appear in a place where Mr. Darcy has any influence. I am quite surprised Mr. Darcy has not exposed Wickham's character to the neighbourhood, Mrs. Gardner said. She, Mrs. Bennet, Jane and Elizabeth were riding in the Gardner carriage. Mr. Bennet followed behind with Mr. Collins, Kitty and Mary in the Bennet coach. He must surely have at least advised the principal shopkeepers. Mr. Wickham has a bad habit of running up accounts on credit wherever he goes, only to leave town without settling his bills, in addition to accruing debts of honour through gambling, Mr. Darcy has advised me. Gambling? Mrs. Bennet let out a small shriek. Oh, sister! Could this young man get any worse? Shocking, shocking behaviour! Well, if Mr. Darcy has not done his duty by the people of Meryton, believe me that I shall. I shall tell Lady Lucas, Mrs. Long, and our sister Mrs. Phillips all about it tonight, and they will ensure that everyone knows, for they do love to gossip. Mrs. Gardner caught Lizzy's eye, and they both smothered chuckles. There had been no opportunity for them to speak further in private, preparations for the ball consuming the rest of the day, after Mrs. Bennet's hysterics and Lydia's rage had been subdued. Dear Aunt Gardiner, this is the most amazing fabric. Jane very gently touched the skirt of her aunt's gown, which spread along the seat beside her. It was a silk that appeared first blue-green and then violet, as the light played across it. Is it from Uncle's warehouses? It is, and I have brought some dress lengths in other colours to be made up into gowns for you girls. It is all about the way the silk is woven, apparently. There is a lovely royal blue and silver for you, Jane, and a burgundy red which changes to gold for Lizzy. I know they are rather deeper colours than young girls would normally wear, she said apologetically to Mrs. Bennet. But Jane is of age, and Lizzy almost so, and with 3 younger sisters out, they are no longer débutantes. Both of them will likely soon be married anyway. Mrs. Bennet waved a hand. Such amazing silk would make the most wondrous wedding gowns, would it not, girls? Look, here we are. The carriage was indeed at that moment making the turn off the main road, which would bring them up Netherfield's long approach. Jane and Elizabeth peered out eagerly, admiring. The magnificent house was ablaze with light, and torches burned along the driveway. A carpet had even been laid from the turning circle up to the portico, to ensure that no lady's slippers might be soiled. And of all this you might soon be mistress, Jane, Mrs. Gardner teased softly, for her elder niece's ears alone. Oh, Aunt, I hope so. Jane looked at her aunt, her heart in her eyes. But I do not know for sure that Mr. Bingley feels that way about me. Does he know how you feel? Her aunt asked sensibly. Most young men would wish to be quite sure of a young lady's affections before they take the plunge. I assure you, I let your uncle know in no uncertain terms of my hopes before he got up the courage to ask for my hand. Really? Jane said in some surprise. Reticent by nature, she had thought that it was better to remain demure and let Mr. Bingley make up his own mind. Her aunt assured her that it was so, and just at that moment the carriage finally stopped. A footman opened the door for them at once, helping them down, and Jane gathered her skirts. Her father's carriage pulled up directly behind them, and her father stepped down and offered Mrs. Bennet his arm. Resigned to having to walk up the stairs with Mr. Collins, Jane was pleasantly surprised when she realised that he had no choice but to offer his arm to Mrs. Gardner instead, as her aunt had precedence. Mrs. Gardner cast a cheery wink at both Jane and Elizabeth, and swept Mr. Collins off up the stairs, proclaiming that as her dear husband was not there to oblige her, and she did so love dancing, Mr. Collins would just have to lead her out for the first set.
"But I have already asked my fair cousin Miss Elizabeth for those dances," Mr. Collins protested.
"Oh, Lizzy will get partners readily enough. She's a pretty young thing, whereas no one will ask an old woman like me to dance," Mrs. Gardner announced. "You don't mind if I steal your opening partner, do you, Lizzy?" She winked over her shoulder at her niece. "I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours, dear aunt," Elizabeth responded, though she could hear Jane choking beside her at Mrs. Gardner's referring to herself as an old woman. Only 30, though the mother of 4 children, she was fresh-faced and very beautiful, and could be thought no older than Jane. And certainly, Elizabeth thought, there could be no lady at the ball more finely attired, for not only was Mrs. Gardner's gown made of that amazing, colour-changing silk, but it was cut in the very latest town fashion. Caroline Bingley certainly turned an unpleasant shade of green at the sight of that gown. Confident that she herself would be the best-dressed, handsomest lady at the ball, she stared angrily at this lovely, confident woman dressed in a gown that must have cost no few guineas. She almost strangled on her own rage when she realised that this was one of the Bennets' Cheapside relations. She acknowledged Mrs. Gardner's introduction with a minuscule tip of her head and an attempt to look down her nose, which failed rather, as Madeline Gardner was a tall woman and topped Caroline Bingley by half a head at least. In the end, Miss Bingley snapped her gaze away with a dismissive sniff, and was then confronted with the obsequiously smiling Mr. Collins, who delivered a clumsy bow at just the wrong moment and almost head-butted her bosom. Mrs. Gardner had to conceal a fit of giggles with a few strategic coughs, as did Elizabeth. Fortunately, Kitty was as yet beyond the threshold and did not see. Mr. Bingley, of course, had eyes for no one but his Jane, looking even more lovely than usual in a gold and white gown that flowed around her tall, slender form. Lifting her hand to his lips, he gazed for a long moment into her deep blue eyes. Words failed him until Elizabeth politely coughed, reminding him that he was holding up the receiving line, and even then it took him a couple of attempts to make words come out.
"Miss Bennet, I am awestruck. No doubt my words will do paltry justice to your beauty, but pray allow me to say how very well you look tonight."
Resolved to be bold, Jane lifted her eyes to his and very gently squeezed his fingers. "Mr. Bingley, thank you for your kind compliment. You look most handsome yourself, and I am exceedingly flattered that you have asked me to open the dancing with you." His delighted smile was all the affirmation of his feelings she might have asked for, and she returned the smile with a bright one of her own. It required another subtle cough from Elizabeth before they recollected themselves, and Bingley finally released Jane's hand, turning to greet her sisters. Elizabeth, looking in vain to see if Mr. Wickham had chosen to attend, joined Charlotte Lucas in the drawing-room. Relieved of the obligation of dancing with Mr. Collins, she watched with a smile as Mr. Bingley led Jane to the head of the line. Mr. and Mrs. Hurst followed, and then Mr. Darcy with Miss Bingley. Some few minutes later, the dance brought Mr. Darcy face to face with Mrs. Gardner, and Elizabeth watched with some glee as Mr. Darcy almost tripped over his own feet, his expression thunderstruck.
"Cousin Madeline?" Mr. Darcy gasped. "What are you doing here?"
"Oh," Mrs. Gardner replied airily, "visiting Edward's family, dear. Did you not know that Mrs. Bennet is his sister?" The pattern of the dance separated them before more words could be spoken. But Elizabeth saw Mr. Darcy glance very frequently at Mrs. Gardner, and then at her mother, and even herself. She had not been able to hear their words, but could guess what they might have been from his astounded expression. Miss Bingley, very annoyed at his inattention, badgered him as to the reason, but he could only respond vaguely that he had not expected to see one of his distant relations here. At the conclusion of the first dance, Kitty, who had been dancing with an officer, came hurrying up to Elizabeth. "He isn't here, Lizzy. Wickham hasn't come. Denny said he went to town yesterday on important business, but he said that Wickham wanted to avoid a certain person here. He must have meant Mr Darcy." "Knowing what we do now," Elizabeth said, "that is no very great surprise. It is rather hard to tell falsehoods about someone when they are present to refute your accusations, after all." She had spent the half-hour of the first set quietly apprising Charlotte Lucas and the Mrs. Long, who were standing nearby, of their intelligence regarding Mr. Wickham, and could hear her mother holding court on the subject, rather less quietly, among the matrons on the other side of the room. "It is very shocking," Sarah Long agreed. "He is so gallant and so handsome." "I dare say that it is a lesson to us all that a handsome face is no guarantee of an equally handsome character," Charlotte remarked. "Sometimes those not considered so handsome are the very best of people." Elizabeth squeezed Charlotte's arm, and her friend smiled at her. "And those who are both handsome and sweet-natured are like Jane. No one can help but adore her," Sarah Long sighed. "Even if I am just a bit envious. Look, even though Mr Bingley will not dance with her again so soon, he will not leave her alone for even a minute. They are going to sit out this set together." Elizabeth smiled at the sight, and at that moment a group of the militia officers came up, importuning them to dance. Elizabeth accepted Captain Carter's offered escort and took her place in the line. As she did so, she glimpsed Mr Darcy speaking with her aunt, as he escorted her to an alcove where they could talk privately.
"Cousin Madeline, this is an unexpected pleasure."
Darcy had a genuine smile on his face.
"I never would have suspected you to be related to the Bennets."
"Why not?" she asked pointedly. "Had not Miss Bingley made you aware of their Cheapside connections in pointing out their inferiority?" Darcy winced. Miss Bingley had indeed several times, emphasising the word cheap every time she did.
"She did, but I had no idea it was you."
"What difference should it make? Cousin Fitzwilliam, I shall be frank. My niece has told me that you have been behaving as though you feel yourself very much above your company here in Hertfordshire, finding fault and looking down on the locals, and even severely insulting her appearance."
"What?"
Darcy blinked.
"Insulting whose appearance? Which niece?"
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet." And when he disagreed emphatically, she raised her eyebrows. "Do the words 'not handsome enough to tempt me' not ring any bells in your mind, cousin?"
"Oh, no," he said weakly. "She heard me."
"She most certainly did, and I am most shocked at your incivility. Now come, I know your mother and your aunt the Countess taught you better than that, no matter if you do, erroneously, think the young lady in question to be beneath your notice." Darcy attempted to excuse himself by claiming he had only been trying to dissuade Bingley from pressing him to dance, but Mrs. Gardner did not let up. She only pointed out that he should have been doing his duty and dancing anyway, if there were young ladies in want of a partner. And how he could think Elizabeth Bennet not handsome was quite beyond her comprehension anyway.
"I have long since concluded that I was very wrong in that first assessment, cousin," Darcy said then. "While her face may not be perfectly symmetrical, and she has not the classical prettiness of her eldest sister, her eyes are among the finest I have ever seen, and her form is most pleasing. I am coming quickly to consider her among the most handsome women of my acquaintance, I assure you."
I am glad you have not lost your eyesight as well as your manners, Mrs. Gardner said tartly. You owe her an apology. But before I release you to make it, I must let you know that I am here rather suddenly on account of a letter with some rather disturbing intelligence I received from Elizabeth just yesterday. You are aware, of course, of Mr. Wickham's presence here with the militia. She told him of Wickham's defamation of his character, his attempt to charm Elizabeth, and then asked Darcy, very soberly, why he had not already exposed Wickham.
"I cannot, cousin," Darcy said, clenching his fists. "I dare not." Very quietly, in a voice so soft that Mrs. Gardner had to strain to hear him, he told her that Wickham had attempted to convince his young sister Georgiana into an elopement the previous summer at Ramsgate, his objective, of course, to gain control of Miss Darcy's dowry of £30,000. Only the merest chance had seen Darcy arrive for an unexpected visit in time to forestall their departure. Darcy had seen Wickham and Mrs. Young, his untrustworthy accomplice, who had then been employed as Georgiana's companion, run out of town immediately, but he dared not do more, for fear that the two of them would blacken Georgiana's reputation. Shocked and horrified, Mrs. Gardner quite understood. However, this only hardened her resolve that she must be the one to safeguard Meryton and its residents from Wickham's evil. My sister Mrs. Bennet is already alerted to warn everyone in the district with daughters of an age to interest Wickham, and we shall also ensure that no shopkeepers extend him credit and risk being left with bad debts. Have I your permission to make it known that he was well compensated for the Kimpton living? Darcy was quite agreeable to that, and was talking with Mrs. Gardner about her husband and children when they were interrupted by Caroline Bingley, asking if he knew where her brother had disappeared to. "I have not seen him since the conclusion of the first dance," Darcy said equably, "but I dare say he is about somewhere. Miss Bingley, have you met my cousin, Mrs. Gardner?"
"Your cousin?" Caroline Bingley froze. "I thought you were introduced as Mrs. Bennet's sister by marriage," she said rather rudely to Mrs. Gardner. "I am both, Miss Bingley. My husband is Mrs. Bennet's brother, but I myself originally hail from Lambton in Derbyshire, very close to Pemberley. Mr. Darcy is kind to acknowledge me as a relative. The connection is rather distant."
"The Darcy family has become very small in recent generations," Mr. Darcy interrupted. "Other than Georgiana, you and your brother are my closest relatives yet living on the Darcy side, and I am very happy to claim you and Edward as family."
Mrs. Gardiner smiled at him affectionately and put her hand on his arm. "As we are you, Cousin Fitzwilliam." Caroline Bingley almost exploded with rage, determining then and there that she would make Darcy cut this ghastly connection when she was mistress of Pemberley, although perhaps not before discovering where the woman had found that amazing silk. She pasted an insincere smile on her face. "Well, of course, any relative of Darcy's is welcome at Netherfield. Please, may I escort you to the refreshment table?" She cast Mr. Darcy a smile over her shoulder as she led Mrs. Gardner away, hoping that he noticed how solicitous she was being to his relative. But he wasn't even looking at her, was instead casting his gaze around the room, and then frowning at someone in the line of dancers. Chapter 4. Charles Bingley was rather pleased with himself for coming up with an excuse to take Jane out of the room when he noticed that she had become rather flushed after their dance. The terrace was far too cold on a late November night, so instead he invited her to stroll with him along the hall and glance into a room which had been set up for cards.
"I must check on the comfort of all my guests, Miss Bennet, but I would not for a moment forego your company."
"Nor I yours," Jane said, blushing even brighter. After a glance into the card-room, they turned about and strolled back, Jane's hand still on Bingley's arm. Glancing at her demurely downcast eyes and pink cheeks, Bingley made a decision. He had thought about putting it off until he returned from the trip to London he must make on the morrow, but why wait? His angel was right here with him, and he might never get a better opportunity to speak to her without everyone knowing what he was about. No one else was in the hall. They were quite unobserved.
"If you will indulge me a moment longer, Miss Bennet."
He took a key from his pocket and opened a door which had previously been locked. "But of course," Jane said automatically, following him into the opened room. "Oh," she gulped, as she realised it was obviously his study and he was closing the door behind her. "Mr. Bingley, we really should return to your guests."
"Dearest, loveliest Jane," he said, and she fell silent, her eyes widening as she realised what was happening. "I do not care about any of my other guests. I want only to spend every minute of this night, and every minute of the rest of my life, in your company and ensuring your happiness. Would you do me the very great honour of agreeing to become my wife?"
"Oh, yes, please," Jane said, surprising even herself with her emphatic agreement. She knew she had said exactly the right thing as his delighted smile appeared, and a moment later he was taking her in his arms and bestowing her very first kiss. Jane closed her eyes as his lips brushed lightly against hers. Bingley deepened the kiss as she made no effort to pull away, and she reached up her hands to put them on his shoulders. A knock on the door behind Jane made them both jump, and they separated and stared at each other, wide-eyed.
"Ahem," Mr. Bennet's voice said politely from the other side of the door. "I am afraid I saw the two of you go in there, and 5 minutes is all I am prepared to allow you, Mr. Bingley. I think perhaps the two of us should have a little word, anyway."
"Damn and blast," Mr. Bingley muttered. Jane, for some reason, found this unaccountably funny and began to laugh, her fingers coming up to cover her mouth as she tried to stop herself. "I'm afraid you've compromised me hopelessly," she giggled. "He'll make you marry me."
"That will be perfectly acceptable to me."
Bingley eyed her with amusement as he opened the door. Mr. Bennet slipped into the room and glanced at both of them, his eyes alight with mirth.
"Well, since my daughter does not appear to be in any distress, Mr. Bingley, is there anything you would like to ask me?" "Miss Bennet has done me the very great honour of agreeing to become my wife," Mr. Bingley began a bit pompously, but Jane interrupted him. "Oh, Papa, you will give us your blessing, will you not?" "Dear Jane."
His smile broadened as he took in her flushed cheeks and slightly swollen lips.
"I think I had better. Yes, Mr. Bingley, I shall be very glad to welcome you into my family. You don't need to reassure me how much you will love and care for my daughter. I have been able to see it since the first moment you met, and I could not have parted with her to anyone who would not care for her as you will."
"Thank you, sir." Mr. Bingley seized his hand and shook it gratefully.
"You will never regret it, I promise you."
"Good, good," Mr. Bennet said equably, kissing his daughter's pink cheek.
"I dare say you will want to make the announcement at supper. Excellent. Now, Jane, he has mussed you a little. You had best go to the withdrawing-room and tidy yourself."
Once his daughter had left the room, he turned to a rather red-faced Mr. Bingley.
"I well remember how it is to be young and in love, sir, and a kiss upon the occasion of an engagement is quite the accepted thing these days, I believe. But there will be no more of that until after the two of you have said your vows.
"Yes, sir," said a rather deflated Mr. Bingley, regretting that he had barely had a moment to snatch that long-desired kiss.
"Would you be amenable to a wedding at Christmas time, then?" He brightened. "We'd just have time to get the banns called." "I think if you call at Longbourn tomorrow, this would be a conversation you and Jane should have with Mrs. Bennet," Mr. Bennet said, hastily retreating. Imaginings of interminable talk of lace and wedding breakfasts floated through his head, and he said, "I have no objections to a wedding sooner rather than later, if Jane agrees." Jane was, at that moment, floating into the withdrawing room on a cloud of pure happiness. Dreamily, she smiled at herself in the mirror, making absolutely no effort to straighten her ruffled curls. Elizabeth entered the room a few minutes later, a little disarranged herself after a rather energetic dance, and saw Jane. Arriving beside her, she observed her sister's blissful countenance and disturbed appearance, and took it on herself to lightly tweak Jane's curls back into place. "You look very happy, dearest," she said softly. "Oh, Lizzy, if only everyone could be as happy as I! I do not deserve such happiness." "No one deserves it more than you, darling Jane." Elizabeth smiled gladly on her sister. "Mr. Bingley proposed?" She kept her voice very low, so that others would not overhear. "It is to be announced at supper," Jane whispered back. "He has papa's permission." Such joy was then Elizabeth's that she kissed Jane's cheek and assured her, though in low tones, that there could be no one who could wish the couple greater felicity. Seeing then the eyes of other ladies turned to them in curiosity, Elizabeth threaded her arm through her sister's and led her back to the ballroom. No sooner had they entered but they were accosted by Mr. Collins, who, mopping his face with an increasingly limp and sodden handkerchief, was about to request of Elizabeth that she honour him with the next dance, having had to surrender the first to her aunt, than Jane held out an imperious hand. "I am not engaged for this dance, cousin. I am sure you did not mean to overlook my precedence as the elder sister." Nothing, not even a dance with Mr. Collins, could blight Jane's happiness that night, and she determined then and there that their idiot cousin would not impose himself on Elizabeth. Catching Mr. Bingley's eye as he entered the room and approached her, she glanced meaningfully at Elizabeth, took Mr. Collins' hand, and walked towards the forming line of couples. "Are you engaged for this dance, Miss Elizabeth?" Bingley arrived at her side mere moments before Darcy, who had been trying to get to her through the crush since the moment he saw her walk back into the room. "If not, will you do me the honour?" "Gladly, Mr. Bingley." Elizabeth accepted his hand, and was startled when Mr. Darcy said, "And if you might reserve the next set for me, Miss Elizabeth, I should be most grateful." Yes, certainly, Mr. Darcy," was all the response she could think of to make, and was rewarded by the sight of him making her a rather low bow as Bingley led her away. She stared back at him, perplexed, and found that he did not take his eyes from her. But she was soon distracted by Mr. Bingley, who had guessed from her smiling countenance that Jane had shared their news, and who was eager to receive her congratulations and welcome to the family, though they had to speak very quietly to avoid word being broadcast across the company rather sooner than they wished. At the conclusion of the set, Mr. Collins rushed to attempt again to engage Elizabeth, but this time she was able to inform him that she was already spoken for in the next set, and when Mr. Darcy came to claim her, Mr. Collins could do nothing but bow and scrape, and praise Mr. Darcy for his excellent condescension in singling out Mr. Collins' own intended choice. "Intended choice," Mr. Darcy said, as soon as they were away from Mr. Collins. "Are you engaged, then, to Mr. Collins?" "Never!" cried Elizabeth with passion. "It is all in his own head. I cannot approve of cousins marrying anyway, sir. I have been raised on a farm." She gave him a meaningful look and added, "I cannot but think that it must not be wise in humans either." "You are very wise, Miss Elizabeth, and your thoughts coincide perfectly with my own. It is precisely why I have resisted my aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Her attempts to engage me to her daughter Anne I consider to be ill-advised, for the very reason you have just espoused." "Oh," Elizabeth said, startled.
I had thought it was quite a settled thing. Mr. Collins spoke of it.
It is my aunt's desire, and no doubt she has spoken of it to her clergyman, Darcy said grimly. But mistake me not. Both my cousin Anne and myself are determined that it shall not come to pass. Lady Catherine speaks of it as having been my late mother's dearest wish, but my mother never spoke of it to me, and I was quite old enough when she passed for her to have done so.
The dance was set to begin then, and interrupted their conversation. They did not speak again for some few minutes, until Elizabeth gave Darcy an arch look. "We must have some conversation, Mr. Darcy. Perhaps we shall speak about the dance, or about how well Netherfield looks tonight, though Miss Bingley decried it, claiming it is nothing to your Pemberley."
"Miss Elizabeth," he said seriously, "I have fallen silent because I have been debating how best to begin."
"Begin at the beginning, sir. 'Tis a very good place to start," she said with an impish smile.
"You are correct. Very well, I shall do so. At the very beginning of our acquaintance, before we were even introduced, I insulted you most egregiously, and I sincerely wish to apologize."
Only the long hours of practice in dancing with her sisters kept Elizabeth's feet moving by rote. She looked up into Mr. Darcy's eyes, and, recovering her composure, said teasingly, "Why, sir, I did not remark it. One man's tolerable is another man's handsome, is that which a third may say should wear a sack over her head, so that she should not frighten children."
"Allow me to state, then, this man's honest opinion. Any man who thought you other than uncommonly handsome would need to be examined for eyeglasses."
Unaccountably pleased by the compliment, Elizabeth forgot that she thought Mr. Darcy so proud, and favoured him with the first true smile she had offered him yet. He stared, and she, seeing him stare, coloured and looked away. For several moments longer they continued the dance in silence. Then Mr. Darcy marshalled himself and spoke again.
"My cousin has taken me to task over my poor manners," he said then, "and you are only the first of a number of people to whom I must make amends. To tell the truth, I came to this neighbourhood to get away from a problem which has been much on my mind of late, and it has adversely affected my temper. I am afraid I have been even more silent and withdrawn than is my usual wont. I have not Mr. Bingley's happy knack of recommending myself to strangers anyway, I fear."
Elizabeth could not but smile, and where once she might have asked why not, now she suspected that the tall, handsome man before her might in fact be rather shy. "Your pretty compliment a few moments ago erased your original offence in my eyes, sir, and the words you have just spoken have redeemed your character entirely. I forgive you unreservedly, Mr. Darcy, and if I may do anything to help you make friends in this neighbourhood, I hope that you will ask me. I have lived here all my life, and know my neighbours' every little quirk. Perhaps if I mention them to you before you must speak, you will find yourself smiling involuntarily. A genuine smile oftentimes suffices where pretty words may fall on deaf ears." Mr. Darcy found himself smiling at her again.
"Miss Elizabeth, I may well take you up on your offer, though you may find that you have taken on a far greater task than you ever imagined. Too, you shall have to spend all evening at least at my side, so that you may pass on your pearls of wisdom."
"A suitable penance for me," Elizabeth said, and then took a deep breath. "Mr. Darcy, I owe you an apology too." He blinked and looked surprised.
"I cannot imagine what for, Miss Elizabeth. It is my behaviour that has been at fault. You have been impeccably gracious, even when severely provoked."
"Not entirely, sir. I am at the very least guilty of thinking the worst of you, on no more than the word of a slight acquaintance." Darcy cocked his head, and then he sighed.
"Wickham."
"Yes, sir, and my aunt has shown me the error of my ways. I have always thought of myself as being easily able to discern a person's character, but I was sadly mistaken in both yourself and Mr. Wickham. I believed the very worst of you, solely because he flattered my vanity and you did not, and I must apologise for so misjudging you and allowing my prejudice to colour my opinion."
"I believe we have already agreed that my insulting remark was the first offence," Darcy said after a moment, "and so any prejudice you might have formed against me as a result of it was quite justifiable. As for Mr. Wickham, he is a practised schemer with the happy knack of making friends easily, unlike myself, as we have already established. Far older and wiser heads than yours have been taken in by his charm, not least my own most estimable father, who never could see the wickedness in him."
Elizabeth ducked her head. "I have learned a valuable lesson today," she said in a low voice, "and been humbled by it. I have only now to be ashamed of my own violent and unjustified prejudice." To her very great surprise, she felt him squeeze her hand as they passed in the dance.
"We have both learned a lesson from our mutual relative," Darcy said quietly, "and no doubt it is her hope that we shall continue to learn, and become better from the learning."
The dance ended then, and on that serious note they both bowed to each other. Darcy offered his arm for Elizabeth to lead her from the floor, only to notice Mr. Collins bearing down on them with a greasy smile. He felt Elizabeth's fingers tense on his arm. Chapter 5.
"Perhaps a little arrogance could be used for good purposes,"
Darcy murmured, softly enough that only Elizabeth heard him, and as Mr. Collins neared, drew himself up and glared very hard at the parson. Mr. Collins, thinking only of getting as close to Elizabeth as he could manage, could not ignore the tall, noble gentleman staring so hard at him, even if he had not been the nephew of his patroness.
"Mr. Darcy, how gracious of you to condescend to dance with my cousin," Mr. Collins grovelled. "Of course, Miss Elizabeth cannot in any way match the grace and loveliness of your fair intended, Miss Anne de Bourgh, but it is good to know that in some small way she might be able to console you for your cousin's absence tonight." "You dare to insult Miss Elizabeth," Darcy said in chilly tones. "No, of course, Mr. Darcy. I meant no offence. Merely to assure you that Miss de Bourgh is the fairest jewel of England, and you are an exceedingly lucky man." "You dare to look admiringly at my cousin?" Darcy's voice chilled further. Elizabeth almost expected to see ice crystals begin forming on his breath. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, was sweating ever more profusely. "Oh, no, of course not, sir," Mr. Collins floundered. "Merely congratulating you on your good fortune, sir, in a match that will unite such great estates. Good God! Any minute now this uncouth idiot is going to start talking of the size of my cousin's dowry and my annual income," Darcy said, disgusted. "A man of God should be above such worldly concerns, sir." "Of course, sir. That is why I am here in Hertfordshire, to extend an olive branch to that part of my family which is less fortunate than myself, by preferring one of the Bennet daughters to a most appropriate situation, as future mistress of Longbourn, by means of condescending to offer my hand in marriage." Mr. Collins smiled toothily at Elizabeth. She did not manage to suppress a shudder, and Darcy felt it through her slender hand, still laid upon his arm. "Mr. Collins, you are mistaken," Darcy said. "The Bennet family is being exceedingly gracious in welcoming you to their home. Mr. Bennet is a gentleman, and his daughters are the equal of any outside the peerage, and certainly above the touch of a humble clergyman, whatever his possible future prospects may be. I know well the parsonage house at Hunsford and the value of that living. I have been looking after my Aunt de Bourgh's financial affairs for some years, after all." Can you even afford a cook and a maid, once the expense of maintaining a wife is added to your budget? You could not possibly expect a daughter of Longbourn to cook and scrub her own floors."
Startled, Mr. Collins blinked, looked at Elizabeth, and back at Mr. Darcy.
"Well, a useful sort of girl Lady Catherine advised me to choose." "A girl who can do her own housework, I dare say she meant," Darcy said. "I am sure Lady Catherine did not understand Longbourn's worth, sir, nor the Bennet family's situation, when she suggested you look for a bride among your cousins. You might as well seek to wed Miss Anderburg yourself. You look so far above your station."
Among Mr. Collins' sputtered, horrified denials, Elizabeth could hear the whispers spreading out from around them. "Can't afford a cook or maid? Asking a Miss Bennet to scrub floors! Inherit Longbourn one day, but Mr. Bennet is only 45 and very hale. Would never allow my daughter to marry into such a situation." That last remark had come from Lady Lucas, who was staring at Mr. Collins with wide, horrified eyes. It was John Lucas, a very old friend, who stepped forward and bowed to Elizabeth, ignoring Mr. Collins entirely. "If you are not engaged for the next, Miss Elizabeth, would you do me the honour?" "I should be delighted, Mr. Lucas," Elizabeth said. Turning to Mr. Darcy, she said, "I thank you for the dance, sir. And for your next move," she lowered her voice, "look to the green chair near the window." Mr. Darcy glanced in the direction she indicated and saw her sensible friend Charlotte Lucas sitting there, conversing politely with two very much older ladies. "I thank you very much for our dance, Miss Elizabeth, and for your neighbourly advice." He gave her a smile and a bow, walked away from the still protesting Mr. Collins, and asked Miss Lucas to dance with such charm that Charlotte blinked uncertainly at him several times before accepting. Mr. Collins retreated in high dudgeon from the whispering, staring crowd around him, mopping his face with his increasingly rancid handkerchief. "Not afford a maid, indeed," he muttered to himself. "Why, I can well afford Sally to come in daily and clean the grates, and Mrs. Meredith to cook my dinners." He paused, though, thinking that Darcy might have a point. A wife would indeed add to his expenses. She would be another mouth to feed, and she would want new dresses, especially if Lady Catherine were indeed to visit her and invite them to Rosings Park to dine. It might be a good idea to have a wife who knew how to cook, at least, as then he could economise by not having to pay Mrs. Meredith. A woman who could look after a few chickens, too, and perhaps milk a goat and grow vegetables. Mr. Collins was unaware that he was muttering his musings out loud. Mary Bennet, sitting behind him on a chair almost concealed by a large flower arrangement in an urn, heard every word, and her eyes widened. She turned to look at Miss Mary King, a plump, freckled redhead equally infrequently asked to dance, who was sitting beside her, and saw that Miss King's mouth was open in a perfect O. "Gossip is for idle minds," Mary Bennet began, but Miss King put a hand over hers and shook her head. "This is not gossip, Miss Mary. We have heard those words directly from the man himself. A wife who can cook and milk goats and grow vegetables? He is looking for a kitchen maid, not a gentlewoman. Do your parents know his situation? Because if he has misrepresented himself to them in seeking to find a bride from your family, then it is your duty to your father and mother to tell them the truth." "I shall speak to my father tomorrow," Mary murmured, looking at Mr. Collins in a new light. She had previously thought that she might suit him quite well herself, but she could not cook, and she had never scrubbed anything other than her own hands in her life. Word of Mr. Darcy's confrontation with Mr. Collins soon reached Mrs. Bennet, who had a fit of nerves and was removed hastily from the room by Lady Lucas and Mrs. Gardner. "I owe you my thanks, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth said, when he came to ask her for the supper dance.
"It is a pleasure to dance with you, Miss Elizabeth." He bowed to her gallantly.
"Not for asking me to dance, Mr. Darcy. Oh, well, for that too, I suppose, but for rescuing me from Mr. Collins. I dare to hope that you discouraged him enough that he might possibly not force me to reject him in terms which will incite his resentment."
"I spoke nothing which was not true, Miss Elizabeth," Darcy said seriously. "I am well aware of the value of the Hunsford living. I visit my aunt every Easter, and to see you in such circumstances would grieve me greatly."
Again he thought he was saying nothing that was not true. That seeing her as Mr. Collins' wife, knowing that that ghastly man had the right to hold Elizabeth, to make love to her, would have torn him apart, he could not say. They proceeded through the dance speaking little, Darcy content to admire Elizabeth, her form lithe and graceful as she skipped and hopped about, and Elizabeth studying the man whom she had previously greatly disliked, but now had to acknowledge was much more than he had first appeared. Yes, he was proud, perhaps too much so, but after what Mrs. Gardner had said to him, he had admitted his sins honestly, and offered her, at least, a handsome apology. It remained to be seen if his attitude to the rest of the neighbourhood would yet improve, but he had indicated to her that he felt he owed a debt of civility to her neighbours, and accepted her offer of aid in paying it. Catching a glimpse of Mr. Collins, standing by himself and glaring in their direction, Elizabeth could not help but smile at Mr. Darcy. He had done her a very great service there, discouraging the repulsive man. She could only hope that Mrs. Bennet too would take heed, and not continue to promote the match. Mrs. Bennet was at that very moment wailing to her husband, who had been brought to her in a retiring room. Mrs. Gardner remained, but persuaded Lady Lucas and Mrs. Phillips to return to the ball, and tell their friends that Mrs. Bennet just required a few moments to compose herself.
"Oh, Mr. Bennet,"
Mrs. Bennet wailed,
"what shall become of us? Lizzy will have to scrub the floors."
Mr. Bennet looked bemused for a moment and then said,
"Do not distress yourself, my dear. I am convinced we shall get along tolerably well without any of our daughters being required to scrub the floors."
"But Mr. Collins—"
Mrs. Bennet began to sob loudly again.
"Sister,"
Mr. Bennet looked to Mrs. Gardner,
"can you shed any light on this matter for me, as I am not quite sure what has my Fanny so distressed?"
"I did not overhear the conversation," Mrs. Gardner admitted, "but Lady Lucas told me that there was some sort of confrontation between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Collins, and Mr. Darcy accused him of presenting himself to your family falsely, that the Hunsford living is worth little, and that if he took a wife, they would not be able to afford a servant to cook and clean."
"I see."
Mr. Bennet plucked his own large handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to his wife, seeing that her lace-trimmed scrap was thoroughly wet, as she was, for once, genuinely crying.
"Well, well, my dear. Allow me to alleviate your suffering by assuring you that none of our daughters, and most certainly not my Lizzy, will ever be scrubbing floors in the Hunsford parsonage. I had already determined to refuse Mr. Collins' suit, even if one of them should be silly enough to accept him."
"But the entail!"
Mrs. Bennet sobbed.
"We shall all be out in the hedgerows."
"Mrs. Bennet, if you will just cease wailing and dry your eyes and come in to supper with me, I have reason to believe that we may hear some news which may appease you a little."
Mrs. Bennet demanded that he tell her at once, but Mr. Bennet refused, claiming that it was not his news to tell, and she would just have to settle herself and come in to supper, or suffer hearing all about it from Lady Lucas and Mrs. Phillips. The thought of having to hear yet more, possibly scandalous, gossip from her friends compelled Mrs. Bennet to calm herself expeditiously, and within a few minutes she was breathing sedately and suffering Mrs. Gardner to wipe her face with a cool cloth.
"There, I hear the supper bell." Mr. Bennet had settled himself in a chair to wait and drawn a book from his pocket. "Allow me to escort the two loveliest ladies here tonight into supper." Both his wife and sister laughed at his nonsense, and Mrs. Gardner exclaimed, "Thomas, you dreadful creature! You know very well your daughters outshine us by far." "Yes, but I have no chance of escorting any of them into supper, do I?" Mr. Bennet smiled. "They are no doubt at this very moment surrounded by fervent young swains begging for the honour."
"You do like to jest with us, Mr. Bennet."
His wife laughed.
"I am sure poor Mary will not. Well, I never."
They were approaching the door of the dining room, and there, right in front of them, was indeed her aforementioned middle daughter, being escorted in on the arm of a tall, fair-haired gentleman in a very well-cut brown coat.
"Who is that, Mr. Bennet?"
"I am sure I have no idea, madam, but let us find out directly." Mr. Bennet steered the two ladies to the table, where the young man was just pulling out a chair for Mary to sit down. "Well, well, daughter, are you having a good time tonight?" Mary blushed uncharacteristically red and nodded mutely. The gentleman, who had been just about to draw out a seat for himself, shot upright and bowed. Seeing that Mary appeared to have lost her tongue, Mrs. Bennet leaped into the breach.
"How kind of you to bring our dear Mary into supper, sir! I am her mother, Mrs. Bennet, and this is her father, Mr. Bennet, and my sister, Mrs. Gardner."
"A pleasure to make your acquaintance," the gentleman stuttered out. "Mr. John Hutton, at your service." They settled down together, Mrs. Gardner hissing in Mrs. Bennet's ear, "He is shy, Fanny. Don't scare him off." She turned a charming smile on Mr. Hutton. "Are you a friend of Mr. Bingley's, pray?" "Both Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, actually. Darcy introduced me to Miss Mary. Darcy and I were at school together, and Cambridge."
"How lovely! And are you from Derbyshire too? I once lived in Lambton, close to Pemberley." Mrs. Gardner smiled at him. "Mr. Darcy and I are very distant cousins, though quite well acquainted." He brightened at her friendly manner, and the stammer eased.
"Pemberley is so beautiful, is it not? I have been there a number of times, travelling through on my way home. I am from near Northallerton, in the North Riding of Yorkshire." He smiled and then said, "But I pray you will excuse me for a few moments. I have promised Miss Mary some supper, and I must make good on my word. May I bring either of you anything?"
"Oh no, Mr. Bennet has gone to get our plates," Mrs. Bennet said, and as soon as Mr. Hutton was out of earshot, leaned over to Mary and hissed, "Who is he, child? If he is a friend of Bingley and Darcy's, he must be well to account, but he is not proud at all." "I know little of him, mamma, save that he very kindly asked me to dance when Mr. Darcy brought him over to introduce him, just before the supper dance. Mr. Darcy said that Mr. Hutton has a very great enjoyment of music, and plays the violin, and that he had heard him play a piece of Haydn that I played at Lucas Lodge a few weeks ago."
Mary shook her head in amazement.
"I cannot imagine that Mr. Darcy has ever noticed what I play. But I was so startled that I did not say no when Mr. Hutton asked me to dance, and, well, he is very nice. We talked about Haydn, and he said that he should particularly like to hear me play one of his sonatas."
She frowned.
"The one he mentioned is rather simple. I learned it long ago." "Then you shall no doubt play it exceedingly well, and he shall be most impressed," Mrs. Gardner put in, well aware that Mary often tried to exhibit above her skill level and showed poorly. The gentleman returned then, followed by a small procession of footmen with a pitcher of lemonade, glasses, a bottle of wine, and several plates piled high with food. The group set to with a will, Mrs. Bennet far too busy enjoying the delightful meal, and wondering on why Mr. Darcy, should introduce an apparently eligible young man to Mary, of all people, to speculate too busily on what her other daughters might be up to. Mrs. Gardiner controlled the conversation adeptly to avoid embarrassing either Mary or Mr. Hutton, and Mr. Bennet listened quietly and kept a weather eye out for his other daughters. He was pleased to note that although Kitty had been escorted in by an officer, it was the slightly older and more sensible Captain Carter, who had seated Kitty between himself and Colonel Forster, where she could not get into mischief with the younger officers. He was glad he had put his foot down and insisted Lydia stay at home. Undoubtedly she would be behaving disgracefully and making a cake of herself, rather like young Maria Lucas, who was giggling incessantly between two of the younger officers. Mr. Bennet glanced around the room, checking for his other girls, and saw them sitting together. Jane, of course, was beside Mr. Bingley. From this angle, Mr. Bennet suspected they were actually holding hands under the table. He smiled indulgently. The puzzle, though, was that Elizabeth sat beside Mr. Darcy, who was leaning over towards her and listening intently to every word out of her mouth. The man was even smiling, the first time that Mr. Bennet had seen that expression on him in their several meetings. Miss Bingley sat on the other side of Mr. Darcy, her mouth turned down sulkily. This evening was not going at all the way she had planned. None of the town friends had come, sending various excuses, but she could read between the lines that they pitied her, forced to host a ball for her brother in this ghastly country backwater. Several of her brother's friends had, though, and while they obligingly asked her to dance so that she was never without a partner, they all seemed far more interested in dancing with one or the other of those ghastly Bennet girls. And while Darcy had danced the first with her, she hadn't really left him much option. He seemed to have been avoiding her thereafter, and was now being monopolised by Miss Eliza. Caroline's palm itched with the desire to smack that arch little smirk off the chit's face. Chapter 6. Supper was over, and singing began to be talked of. Mr. Hutton leaned over to Mary, to whom he had been talking very seriously throughout the meal, and said, "Miss Mary, it would give me the greatest pleasure to hear you play. Do you have the Haydn with you, or am I to be disappointed?"
"I know it by heart, Mr. Hutton," Mary said shyly. "Of course I shall play it for you."
And she went to the pianoforte, sat down, and played a lovely, simple air with unaffected grace. Afterwards she was so astounded by the enthusiastic applause that she froze, her hands over the keyboard, her eyes as wide as a startled deer. Seeing her sister's panic, Elizabeth rose and went to her. "Let us have a duet, Mary." She mentioned another piece that they both knew well and had often played together, and they played and sang very prettily, Elizabeth taking the trickier higher part, her voice supporting Mary's weaker one, so that they sounded very well together. Again the applause was most enthusiastic. Mary caught a glimpse of Mr. Hutton standing, clapping vigorously, and blushed scarlet. Elizabeth made her stand up, and they both curtsied to the audience. Mr. Bingley approached, a huge smile spread across his face. "Charming, charming! Well, my friends," he turned about to face his guests, "this seems like the most opportune time for me to thank you all for attending our ball." He paused as they applauded again and bowed. "And to share with you the information that the two talented ladies who have just entertained you so well, I am proud to claim as my future sisters. Yes," he nodded and smiled as a gasp went through the room, "the lovely Miss Jane Bennet has tonight consented to make me the happiest man alive." "You're already the happiest man alive, Charles," one of his friends shouted. "But now you're the luckiest, too." Amid the laughter and cheers, Darcy escorted a blushing Jane to Bingley's side. He took her hand in his and kissed it flamboyantly. Left with her sister and a somnolent Mr Hurst, Caroline Bingley buried her face in her hands and groaned. Could this wretched night get any worse? She flinched as a screech sounded behind her.
"Oh, Mr Bennet!"
Mrs. Bennet screamed.
"You teasing man! You let out not a hint of this!"
She whacked him gently on the arm.
"Oh, Jane! Mr Bingley!"
But there was a whole crush of people between herself and her daughter and son-to-be, and she had to content herself to wait. They came to her soon enough, and she embraced Jane with tears of delight, and Mr Bingley no less happily.
"You will be the happiest couple in the world!" she cried. "Oh, Jane, you will never want for anything!"
"I assure you that she will not, Mrs. Bennet," Mr. Bingley said jovially. "I fully intend to order Jane her own carriage as a wedding gift, and while we may not have the family jewels of some of the oldest families, I have some very nice pieces left to me by my mother, and I am sure that I can find a few more that will do justice to your daughter's beauty. Indeed, just a few weeks ago I saw a wonderful sapphire necklace in the window at Garrard's that would match her blue eyes quite perfectly." He kissed Jane's hand again, and she smiled at him, a blaze of love in her gaze, though she said softly that she needed no such extravagant gifts.
"Sapphires from Garrard's! A new carriage! Oh, Jane!"
Mrs. Bennet fell weeping on her daughter's neck. Caroline Bingley ground her teeth. She had been the one who pointed that necklace out to her brother, hinting that he might buy it for her. And now this country nobody would be the one draped in the jewels she had coveted. Hatred coursed through her, but then she took a deep breath and comforted herself that such nouveau riche jewels would be beneath her, once she took possession of the Darcy ancestral jewels. She had coaxed Georgiana into talking about them once, when looking at the painted images of spectacular pieces on the Darcy ancestors in Pemberley's portrait gallery, and coveted them ever since. The necklace of pearls and diamonds worn by Darcy's mother in her portrait made the sapphires at Garrard's look like cheap glass beads. Comforting herself by imagining the magnificent choker around her own throat, as she hosted a ball for the cream of the ton in Darcy's grand house in town, enabled her to paste a smile onto her face as she went to congratulate her brother and welcome Jane to the family.
"Miss Bingley looks as though she'd just tasted a lemon, doesn't she?"
Mrs. Gardner said softly, having walked up beside them, unnoticed by Elizabeth and Darcy. She spoke so quietly that only the two of them could hear her, but Darcy let out a snort of laughter, and Elizabeth had to hastily bite her tongue to suppress an impending fit of giggles.
"Aunt Madeline, that is unkind,"
Elizabeth said primly, when she finally got control of herself.
"Surely not a lemon. Perhaps an unripe gooseberry."
Darcy had to turn his back, covering his mouth. His cousin had a wicked wit and sense of humour, and clearly Elizabeth had spent a lot of time in her company. He could hear them now behind him, discussing what Miss Bingley might have eaten to put that expression on her face.
"No, I know. Curdled milk,"
Elizabeth said with satisfaction.
"Soured wine. An apple with a wasp in it."
"Please cease," Mr. Darcy choked out, "or I am going to disgrace myself with a fit of laughter I cannot control." He felt Mrs. Gardner's hand press lightly on his arm.
"All right, Fitzwilliam. We will not force you to make yourself ridiculous." "Oh, Mr. Darcy could never look ridiculous. He is without fault. We concluded that a few days hence," Elizabeth said lightly.
"You said such. I never claimed it. I said that anyone might be made ridiculous by one whose first object in life is a joke."
"And I said that is no faithful picture of me. I love to laugh, but I do not laugh at what is wise or good."
Now, play nicely, my dears," Mrs. Gardner said, hearing their voices becoming raised. Mr Darcy and Elizabeth both paused, glanced at their mutual relative, and silently acknowledged her to be correct. "I no longer believe that your defect is your propensity to hate everyone," Elizabeth offered, in a quieter tone. Darcy smiled.
"I do believe that you choose to wilfully misunderstand, but it is done so charmingly that I cannot call it a fault in you. Besides, your eyes sparkle in a particular way when you are deliberately misinterpreting my words. I am learning to recognise when you are teasing me."
Elizabeth smiled at that, her cheeks turning bewitchingly pink. Darcy gazed into her fine eyes and thought about asking her to dance, before realising regretfully that he had already done so twice, and a third time would be well beyond the limits of propriety. Instead, he bowed to them both.
"May I escort you back into the ballroom? Cousin Madeline, might I request a dance?"
"How delightful," Mrs. Gardner said. "I should love to." On re-entering the ballroom, Elizabeth looked around a little fearfully for Mr. Collins, but he was nowhere in sight. As Mrs. Gardner and Darcy walked to join the dancers, Elizabeth looked for Charlotte, but she was dancing too. In the end, she spotted Mary sitting down and went over to join her, but to her surprise found that she was in very earnest conversation with an unfamiliar gentleman. On seeing Elizabeth, Mary smiled and called her over to introduce Mr. Hutton, who was so delighted that a young lady was talking to him without so much as mentioning his stammer or looking at him with pity, he almost forgot to stammer at all. He made a very good impression on Elizabeth, who, on seeing a slightly insecure, jealous look on Mary's face, consciously made an effort not to appear too vivacious and charming. She could not help a start of surprise, though, when Mr. Hutton said,
"Oh, I would not have missed this ball for the world. Both Bingley and Darcy wrote to me, saying that I must come, for this part of Hertfordshire held such an abundance of beauty, I would be foolish to miss out."
He smiled, bowing slightly to both ladies, leaving them in no doubt what type of beauty his friends had described. "Of Mr. Bingley I can well believe it," Elizabeth said. "But Mr. Darcy? Surely you exaggerate."
"Never, Miss Elizabeth. Let me see, what did the letter say?"
He frowned, looking upwards in thought.
"I have lately found much felicity in admiring the sparkling eyes of a beautiful woman, of whom there are several hereabouts."
"Oh, shocking!" Elizabeth and Mary cried at once, both blushing, and Mr. Hutton chuckled.
"Honestly, I was quite shocked too. I had no idea that Darcy could wax so eloquent. I'd decided I had to come for myself, to see whose eyes had engendered such sentiments."
His gaze rested curiously on Elizabeth for a moment, and he offered her a small bow. Scarlet-cheeked, she could not meet his gaze, recalling Mr. Darcy's words of just a few moments ago.
"Your eyes sparkle in a particular way," he had said,
and earlier when they were dancing, he had called her uncommonly handsome. Thinking that Mr. Darcy might possibly admire her created an unfamiliar warm feeling in Elizabeth's stomach. "I don't even know if I like him," she murmured under her breath, watching Mr. Darcy and her aunt dance gracefully. Her aunt was laughing, and Mr. Darcy produced that broad smile again, the one that showed his dimples. "Before tonight, I did not even know that he had dimples. But he is really a very handsome man, especially when he smiles." She sighed and turned away. He might admire her, but it would surely go no further than that. No doubt, even if he did not marry his de Bourgh cousin, there were wealthy and probably titled ladies queuing up for him to select his bride. A penniless country girl would be a very long way down the line. Elizabeth half expected to be importuned by Mr. Collins at any moment, now that she no longer had Mr. Darcy standing beside her to protect her with his superior rank and was quite delighted to hear from her Aunt Phillips that he had been offered a ride as far as Longbourn with the Gouldings, who were going early, and left with them, pleading a headache. Mrs. Bennet, on hearing this news, just restrained herself from screaming and fainting. Her darling Lydia was home at Longbourn with only servants to guard her. The last thing Mrs. Bennet wanted was a potential compromise of her favourite daughter by that odious man who would make poor darling Lydia scrub floors. She found her husband and hissed to him the news, and that they must return home at once to protect Lydia's reputation. Glancing about the room, Mr. Bennet spied Kitty coming off the floor breathless and heading for the punch bowl.
Now, now, my girl, that's quite enough of that. Your mother is tired and I am taking her home now, and I think you had best come with us. Your aunt can escort the other girls.
Spying Elizabeth watching the dancing, he made his way over to tell her. She only nodded abstractedly and wished him a good night. Following his dance with Mrs. Gardner, Darcy could not quite resist returning to Elizabeth's side. He offered to fetch her a glass of punch or lemonade, but she declined politely, saying that she was not thirsty. "May I ask you a question, Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth asked, after they had watched the dancing in silence for a few minutes.
"You may ask anything you wish of me, Miss Elizabeth," he said, quite sincerely.
Elizabeth's cheeks again turned pink. She looked away from him, and then she took a deep breath, seeming to gather her courage. "I dare say you have observed that my youngest sister Lydia is not here tonight."
"Indeed," Darcy agreed.
Miss Lydia would have been hard to miss, loud, silly, and prone to exposing herself as such.
"Is she unwell?"
"No." Elizabeth tilted her head at him. "She is guilty of being a foolish, headstrong girl. As am I, but Lydia was silly enough to voice her opinions aloud to our father."
"Headstrong, I can well believe," he said dryly. "But I could never think you foolish, Miss Elizabeth. Your wits are too sharp for that."
"Perhaps then it is pride I am guilty of. Indeed, the worst kind of pride, for in my vanity I believed that I had a superior understanding, and I did not want to believe the words of one who had not merely a belief in their own cleverness, but true knowledge."
"I have not the pleasure of understanding you," Darcy said after a few moments.
"I am talking in circles, I suppose, because I do not like to admit I am wrong. Very well, Mr. Darcy, I shall cut to the chase. I believed my own judgment of character superior enough that I dared to question, although I was not insolent enough to do so aloud, the veracity of my aunt's knowledge of the past deeds of our mutual acquaintance, Mr. Wickham." The black rage that descended over Mr. Darcy's face for a moment then alarmed her, and she took a slight step back, wide-eyed. He calmed quickly with a deep breath, though, and reached to offer her his arm.
"Pray, will you take a stroll with me, Miss Elizabeth? The room is warm."
They strolled along the hallway, unknowingly following in the earlier footsteps of Jane and Mr. Bingley. The party was louder now, many of the guests somewhat inebriated and raucous. Darcy kept Elizabeth close to him by means of placing his free hand over hers on his arm and leaning down to speak quietly in her ear.
"Mr. Wickham is a blackguard of the first order, Miss Elizabeth. What did Mrs. Gardner tell you?"
She looked up at him, wide-eyed and vulnerable, and whispered, "Louise."
"I see. Well, she was not the first or the last girl he left in such a situation. I have discovered, since inheriting Pemberley, that my father paid for the support of no less than 3 illegitimate children of Wickham's in Derbyshire alone. God only knows how many more may be scattered around the country. I could not believe, knowing of his proclivities, that my father still left him a living, but I have known for many years that Mr. Wickham should never be a clergyman. I paid him the value of the living, agreed between us as £3,000, and told him never to darken my door again.
£3,000! Elizabeth's voice was barely a squeak. But that is a fortune!
It is, apparently, but 1/10 of what Wickham feels he deserves.
Darcy lowered his voice further.
Miss Elizabeth, I must ask you to keep what I am about to tell you in the strictest confidence. My cousin, your aunt, is aware of the facts, but I would prefer you told no one else, not even Miss Bennet.
You have my word, Mr Darcy, Elizabeth promised fervently, thinking that keeping a secret was the least she owed him, after hating him so misguidedly.
The reason I have not exposed Wickham's character to the neighbourhood is that he might have it in his power to ruin my sister's good name. Just 3 months ago, in August.
He went on to tell Elizabeth all about Ramsgate and Mrs. Young, and concluded,
But I think I shall write a letter to my cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who is with the regulars, and ask him to have Wickham's militia commission investigated. I cannot imagine where he received letters of recommendation for his good character, unless they were forged, as Mrs. Young's references turned out to be.
Elizabeth stopped walking and looked up at him, her beautiful dark eyes swimming with tears. "Oh, Mr. Darcy," she said softly, "I am so sorry. For everything. For your poor sister, for misjudging you, for thinking ill of you. No wonder you did not want to dance with anyone at the assembly. If such a thing were on my mind, it would take me 2 years to want to dance again, I am sure, not 2 months. How could you want to take pleasure in anything, knowing how sorely her poor heart must be hurting?" Darcy smiled at her, grateful for her understanding.
She is much recovered. Her new companion, Mrs. Annesley, is a wonderful lady, and has done a great deal to help Georgiana understand that it was not her fault, that Wickham preyed on her in hopes of gaining pecuniary advantage from me. I must take some share of the blame also, because I never made her aware of his faults. She knew no ill of him. I have been trying to keep her as my baby sister, trying, as I dare say all fathers and brothers do, not to allow their little girls to grow up, to keep them innocent of the world's harsher truths.
Elizabeth smiled at that. "You have learned a valuable lesson then, I dare say. My father could no doubt save you a great deal of heartache if you would only consult with him over what to expect from teenage girls. He has, after all, a vast amount of experience on the subject." Darcy was struck by the notion, and nodded.
"I think you must be correct, Miss Elizabeth, as usual. Thank you for your wise counsel. I am sure your father has learned a great deal about dealing with unruly, impertinent daughters."
His eyes twinkled, and Elizabeth's mouth dropped open. "For shame, sir! Their family might call Lydia and Kitty such names, but it is dreadfully rude of you to do so," she sparked back, and he chuckled.
"Did I speak of Miss Lydia and Miss Catherine?"
She playfully swatted at his arm, and he laughed again, a deep rumble of sound. "Wickham described your sister as very proud," Elizabeth said softly, when they had walked in companionable silence for a few moments more. She felt Darcy's arm tense beneath her hand, but it took him a moment to speak.
"That he dares to speak of her yet," Darcy said between gritted teeth. "What else did he say of her?"
Elizabeth had been racking her brain, trying to remember the conversation. "I recall that he said she was affectionate and pleasing as a child, and that he had devoted hours to her amusement."
"Huh!"
Darcy let out a snort.
"Not likely. Wickham was always urging my cousins and I to play games that were far too old for poor Georgiana to join in."
"He described her as handsome and highly accomplished," Elizabeth went on hesitantly, "but said that she was like you, very proud."
"Some might think her so,"
Darcy said after a moment.
But the truth is that she is very, very shy, and quiet in company that she does not know very well. It strikes me that she is rather like your sister Miss Bennet, reserved with those who are not close to her. I must confess to you that before tonight I had not encouraged Bingley in his pursuit of your sister, because I truly did not think that she returned his affections. I rather thought that your mother was promoting the match.
Elizabeth was annoyed at his presumption, but she had to admit him to be partially correct. You are correct in the last part of your surmise, sir. My mother has been most assiduously promoting the match. But Jane does not show her feelings lightly. She fears giving too much of herself and being disappointed. Her heart, though— Darcy pressed his fingers down on hers gently.
You need say no more, Miss Elizabeth. The look on Miss Bennet's face when Bingley announced their engagement told me that I had been very much in error. It was not triumph I saw in her expression, but genuine love, and I am abashed to learn that my assessment of her was so wrong.
They walked a little longer, and then Darcy sighed.
Wickham is right in one particular. I have indeed been guilty of being too proud. I see myself clearly now. As a child, I was taught what was right, but not to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Thinking meanly of those beyond my family circle, I have been properly humbled tonight to learn that some of those whom I had looked upon with disdain are indeed part of that family circle.
That eyebrow of hers that he was coming to love arched high. "Disdain, Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth asked.
To my own shame, yes. Not you, never you. You and Miss Bennet are all that is praiseworthy, but your mother— well, your mother is very much like every matchmaking mother of the ton, who has been thrusting their daughters beneath my nose for years, and I despised her for it. In truth, she has more cause than most, for I see now that it is fear for your future that motivates her to want to see you all well settled, not merely mercenary motives.
They would perhaps have walked longer, but just then Miss Bingley came out of the ballroom. "Goodness me, Mr. Darcy, whatever are you doing out here? You must not monopolise Miss Eliza, you know. I am sure all of the officers are keen to have a dance with her." And she latched on to Darcy's free arm. Her glare at Elizabeth, though, made it clear she felt it was Elizabeth who was monopolising Darcy, and that she would be permitted to do so no longer. Elizabeth offered Caroline a charming smile. "Thank you so much for your concern, Miss Bingley, but I do not feel the need to insure a partner for every dance, merely to gratify my vanity," she said, and giggled inwardly as Caroline's eyes narrowed. Caroline wasn't sure if she had just been the recipient of a barbed comment or not. Had Miss Elizabeth spotted her introducing one or two young ladies into groups of gentlemen just before dances started? Caroline could have been said to be doing her duty as hostess by making sure even the wallflowers got a dance or two, but of course the spare gentleman had to offer her a dance as well. Her vanity would indeed have been pricked if she had not been partnered for every dance. Caroline turned her back on the cheeky country miss, linking her arm through Darcy's and dragging him back into the ballroom. The last dance set was about to start, and she had deliberately avoided finding a partner for this, determined that Darcy would end the ball with her, as they had started it. But he said suddenly, "Excuse me, Miss Bingley," and went over to where his strange stammering friend was talking to another of the Bennet chits, the plain one. A moment later, Mary was standing up, blushing, and accepting Mr. Darcy's hand to join the set. Mr. Hutton moved toward Caroline, smiling, and she steeled herself to talk to the half-wit. At least she wouldn't have to sit the dance out. But then Hutton walked right past her.
Miss Elizabeth, if you do not have a partner for this dance, would you do me the honour?"
Caroline Bingley was left standing all alone as the dance began, seething as she watched the merry foursome smiling and laughing together. Chapter 7. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins had determined, over the course of the evening, that his prospects outweighed his present situation, and that while none of the Bennet daughters had a portion of significance, their father would surely augment his income to provide for his daughter's comfort. Therefore, after breakfast, on finding Miss Elizabeth, Mrs. Bennet, and Kitty sitting together, he addressed the mother.
"May I hope, madam, to solicit the honour of a private audience with your fair daughter Elizabeth in the course of the morning?"
He was reasonably confident of success in this request. After all, Mrs. Bennet had made it clear that her only aim was to see one of her daughters as mistress of Longbourn after herself. He was thus rather surprised when Mrs. Bennet looked up, fixed him with a hard stare, and said, "Certainly not."
"I beg your pardon," Mr. Collins said, quite startled.
"You most certainly may not have a private audience with Elizabeth, Mr. Collins. You can have nothing to say to any of my daughters." And with a sniff, Mrs. Bennet turned back to her household ledger. Mr. Collins stood gaping and flapping his gums. "Just like a carp," Kitty giggled, when he eventually walked out of the room. Elizabeth smiled, but it changed to a frown when she heard knocking on her father's book-room door. "He is gone to papa." "Well, your father will give him no countenance either, I assure you," Mrs. Bennet said. "Ask a daughter of Longbourn to scrub floors and keep chickens," she muttered. Mary had earlier recounted everything that she and Miss King had overheard Mr. Collins say after Mr. Darcy had set him down the previous evening. "Milk a goat! Humph!" "I am glad I shall not have to rely on my own cooking," Elizabeth admitted, and Kitty giggled again. "Oh, Lizzy, it would not have mattered. You should have poisoned him with something or other within a week, and been back home again." All three of them found this highly diverting, and laughed uproariously until Lydia came in and demanded to share the joke. Kitty took her upstairs to explain, and Elizabeth was left alone with her mother. They heard the book-room door open, and Mr. Collins saying loudly that he was done with such ungrateful relations, and should be packing and leaving directly. The door slammed, and they heard him stamping up the stairs. "I should have refused him in any case, Mamma," Elizabeth said after a long moment. Mrs. Bennet sighed and put down her pen. "Yes, Lizzy, I am sure that you would. I cannot say that he is the man I would have chosen for you, for any of you, but there is the entail. Well, we shall just have to hope that Mr. Bingley will be kind to us." She forced a cheerful tone, but Elizabeth was not fooled. "I know that you mean well, Mamma, but you must let us find our own path," she said gently. "You should have made me deeply unhappy if you had forced me into marriage with Mr. Collins." "Yes, well, you are far too good for him." Mrs. Bennet tossed her head. "And besides, now that Jane is to marry Mr. Bingley, you younger girls will be thrown into the path of other rich men." "Mamma!" Mrs. Bennet smirked, and Elizabeth realised, to her astonishment, that her mother was teasing. Mrs. Bennet was rarely seen in such a good mood, and so Elizabeth dared to raise a contentious subject. "Mamma, I must beg you to keep Lydia from going into Meryton for the time being." "Whatever for?" Mrs. Bennet said, frowning, and Elizabeth reached for her hand. "She has not repented her words yesterday, nor apologised to my aunt, and she is still saying that Mr. Wickham is a friend of hers, and she will not turn her back on him. Truly, she is a foolish, headstrong girl, acting childishly, and you know you are the only one she listens to, Mamma."
Only your disapproval will rein in her behaviour. If you do not, she will be beyond the reach of amendment, will surely be known as the most determined flirt that ever made herself and her family ridiculous. To want to associate with a man such as Mr. Wickham, known to be not respectable, how can this in any way not be contemptible? Lydia is vain, ignorant, idle and uncontrolled. My father will not trouble himself to check her, and she will not listen to me. You, mamma, you were the only one with the capability and authority to teach her that her exuberance must be restrained, or the respectability of her whole family will suffer. Mrs. Bennet sat staring at her second daughter for 2 full minutes in silence, and Elizabeth began to fear that she had gone too far. But she would not beg her mother's pardon for speaking the truth, unpalatable though it might be. She remained silent until Mrs. Bennet spoke, waiting for the reprimand that must surely come. "Oh, Lizzy," Mrs. Bennet said softly, "what a very great fool you must think me." "What?" "No, mamma, Do not say it, Lizzy. You are correct. I have been blinded in my panic. I thought that in putting my daughters out, my job of educating them was done, and now all I had to do was find them husbands. But I see now that I was wrong. What I need to do is complete their education, and the right husbands will find them." Elizabeth could think of nothing to say. She looked at her hands as her mother continued. "You are right in so many ways. Lydia's behaviour will never attract any respectable man. I have heard the officers describe her as lively, but in my heart I knew they thought her flirtatious and silly. And Kitty follows where Lydia leads. I made a mistake in persuading your father to bring the 2 of them out at the same time. Kitty needed time away from Lydia, time out in society, with the good example of her elder sisters, to teach her the right way to act. Yes, even Mary," Mrs. Bennet said. "She may not have the beauty of the rest of you, but she is a good girl in her way, and she did very well last night. Mr. Darcy very kindly introduced his friend to her, and Mary made quite an impression." "Mr. Darcy is not at all what we have thought him," Elizabeth said then. "I agree with you entirely. I am persuaded that he may be rather reserved, possibly even nervous in company, where he is not acquainted with everyone. And knowing what we do now of Mr. Wickham, any man who that villain denigrates must be quite the opposite of what he says." "We owe my Aunt Gardner a great debt of gratitude," Elizabeth confessed. "For if she had not come here and warned us about Mr. Wickham, I fear I might well have said something inadvisable to Mr. Darcy last night, and caused a scene, and perhaps the evening would not have turned out quite as well as it did." Mrs. Bennet turned to look at her second daughter. "Does Mr. Darcy admire you, Lizzy?" she asked perceptively. "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted after a moment. "He apologised for insulting me at the assembly, and said that I was actually exceedingly handsome. And Mr. Hutton said that Mr. Darcy wrote to him, saying that there were a number of beautiful young ladies in the neighbourhood." Mrs. Bennet smirked. "Well, well! I am very glad that he exposed Mr. Collins as a fraud, then. You would have been wasted there. 10,000 a year! Jane's will be nothing to it." "Mamma, I pray you do not say anything of it," Elizabeth begged frantically. "Aunt told me last night, on the way home, something of Mr. Darcy's home and his family. Did you know that his uncle is the Earl of Matlock, and Pemberley is one of the vastest estates in England? 10,000 a year is likely only a portion of his wealth. He can look in the very highest circles for a bride. He would not look at a country girl with no dowry or connections." "Perhaps you are right, dear," Mrs. Bennet mused. "And perhaps you are not. Perhaps he is looking for something that he has not yet found among the first circles. To find one's match, sometimes one must look elsewhere." Mamma, please stop. You will embarrass both Mr. Darcy and myself if you thrust me under his nose. All he and I ever do is argue, anyway. He would no doubt want some lady more compliant and agreeable as his wife. Men do not like someone who agrees with their every word, daughter, Mrs. Bennet said quite firmly. I can tell you that. He would have married Miss Bingley by now, if all he wanted was a sycophant. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Gardner coming in to join them. Elizabeth was surprised to find that she did not feel any particular relief, as she would normally have felt when being released from a private conversation with her mother. Indeed, Mrs. Bennet had truly listened to her and respected her opinion, for perhaps the first time in her life. "Ah, sister! I am glad to see you. I should like your opinion. What do you think of Mr. Darcy for our Lizzy?" "Mamma!" Scarlet-cheeked, Elizabeth could not look at either her mother or her aunt. "He should suit her very well, Fanny, and she him. Elizabeth is just the woman to lighten his dour moods with her teasing, and he is strong enough of character to manage her, and intelligent enough to match her wits. And I cannot think of anyone whose love of nature would better suit her to be mistress of Pemberley than our Lizzy." Mrs. Gardner seated herself, smiling at her mortified niece. You... This is a conspiracy," Elizabeth uttered, hiding her face behind her hands. "My motives are pure, dear one. I should only like to see both you and my cousin happy, and after seeing the two of you dance and talk, and walk, last night, I am quite convinced that you could make each other so," Mrs. Gardner said serenely. Elizabeth immediately understood that her aunt had witnessed at least part of her walking in the hallway with Darcy, when he had held her arm close, and they had talked with great intimacy. Mrs. Bennet clapped her hands with delight. "And, of course, with Jane marrying his friend, there will be plenty of opportunities for you to be in his company. Mr. Bingley suggested last night that he would like to marry between Christmas and New Year, and of course Mr. Darcy will stand up with him, and Elizabeth with Jane. We must get you a wonderful dress, my dear. You will never outshine Jane, of course, but you can look very well in your own right. Perhaps the dress length your aunt brought you can be made up." She beamed at her speechless daughter. "I very much doubt that you will have to wait that long to put Lizzy in Mr. Darcy's way," Mrs. Gardner put in. "Why, what do you mean, Madeline? Mr. Bingley has gone to London at least until the end of the week, and Mr. Darcy said that he did not intend to stay in Hertfordshire past the 1st of December. I mean that unless I am very much mistaken, that is Mr. Darcy riding up Longbourn's drive right now," Mrs. Gardner interrupted. "And with him is the gentleman who was so kind to Mary last night, Mr. Hutton, is it not?" Mrs. Bennet shrieked so loudly that Elizabeth actually feared the approaching gentleman might hear. Then she was sent off to go and change into a more becoming frock, and tell Mary to do likewise, and be as quick as she could about it. Elizabeth met Mary at the top of the stairs, grabbed her arm, and pulled her into her room. Jane looked up, startled, from where she was lying on the bed writing in her journal. "Do you like Mr. Hutton?" Elizabeth hissed at Mary. "Lizzy, what? Yes, I liked him very much. What are you doing?" Mary's voice was a squeak as Elizabeth spun her about and started quickly undoing the buttons of her plain brown dress. "He's riding up the drive with Mr. Darcy right now, come to call on you unless I am very much mistaken, and frankly, you look dowdy. Jane, quickly, fetch my pale green muslin. It will set off Mary's green eyes." She snatched off Mary's eyeglasses. "No, you can't have them back. I know very well you hardly need them, and only wear them all the time because you think it makes you look more respectable and studious." Jane, laughing, brought the required dress,
and helped Mary to button it, while Elizabeth loosened the tight bun Mary had put in her hair that morning. A little plaiting and a few pins later, Mary was quite transformed, and her sisters sent her hurrying down the stairs to greet their guests. "Now it's your turn," Jane said. "What?" Elizabeth blinked. "Oh, don't you give me that innocent face. If Mr Darcy is here, I am quite sure that it is to call upon you." "No, Jane, surely on his cousin, our Aunt Gardner," Elizabeth faltered before her sister's steady stare. Unable to lie to her face, she allowed Jane to coax her into a fresh, pretty gown, and drape Jane's own favourite shawl around her shoulders. Jane tidied her curls and kissed her cheek. "Go on down now. No, I shan't come. If they ask after me, tell them I am pining for Mr Bingley. In truth, I shall be busy keeping Kitty and Lydia out of the way." She winked and pushed Elizabeth towards the stairs. "Go on now." "When did all of my family turn into matchmakers?" Elizabeth wondered, a little resentfully, and then blushed as she realised that she was equally guilty, considering what she had just done to Mary. It was thus, charmingly pink-cheeked, that she entered the parlour and came face to face with Mr Darcy. Chapter 8.
"Miss Elizabeth."
"Mr Darcy!" He bowed, and she curtsied. Considering the intimacy of the confidences they had shared the night before, Elizabeth found it odd that she could not look him in the eye. Or perhaps it was the presence of her mother and aunt, both watching her and sporting identical smirks, that inhibited her so. "Mr Hutton," she said, "how pleasant to see you again."
"And yourself, Miss Elizabeth."
They exchanged pleasantries, and then, surprisingly, Mary suggested they take a turn about the garden, since the morning was dry, if not warm. Perhaps she too was feeling the impact of those smug grins, Elizabeth thought. She agreed with alacrity, as did the gentleman, and soon the four young people were walking Longbourn's paths.
"I find this scene curiously familiar," Mr Darcy remarked after a few minutes, as they followed Mr Hutton and Mary, who were deep in conversation.
"How so, sir? This is your first visit to Longbourn."
"Yes, but once again, I seem to be acting as chaperone for one of your sisters and one of my friends," he said dryly.
Elizabeth could not help but giggle behind her hand at that. And then she stopped and looked at him seriously. "Mary is very shy, and even more ignorant of the ways of the world than most girls her age," she said hesitantly. "Is Mr Hutton, is he serious in his interest?"
"John has been looking this age for a girl who would not mind his stammer," Darcy said honestly. "He is very wealthy, actually, although he prefers it not to be known. He has been deceived rather too many times into thinking friendships and regard were given to himself rather than his money."
"Mary does not care about money, and she certainly would not mind his stammer," Elizabeth said with certainty. "If he likes her, then no doubt they should do well together. How lovely if I should see two of my sisters happily wed."
"Do you not wish for such a situation for yourself?"
His voice was deep and soft, and somehow Elizabeth could not quite look at him. "I am determined to marry only a man whom I can esteem and with whom I share a true affection," she said, forcing out a light little laugh. "And since I am such an impertinent, barely tolerable creature, I am convinced there is no sensible, respectable man who might love me. So I am resigned to being a spinster aunt and teaching all of my sisters' many children to draw and play the piano very ill."
"That would be a tragic waste."
Mr Darcy drew her to a halt, and she chanced a glance up at him. He was gazing at her from unfathomably dark eyes, and she pulled her eyes away and looked at her feet.
Miss Elizabeth, you are no doubt the most impertinent lady I have ever met, but I have already made it very clear to you that you are far more than merely tolerable. I do not know if you could ever feel such affection and esteem as you describe towards me, but you must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you."
Elizabeth did not know what to say, and after a moment she began to walk again. It was several long minutes before she could speak. "Mr. Darcy, this time yesterday I despised you more than any other person I had ever met. In the space of one day my feelings have undergone so material a change, I regret to inform you that I have not the slightest idea of what they currently are." He laughed at that, and assured her that she should take all the time she needed to begin sketching his character anew. "But are you not leaving shortly, Mr. Darcy? My mother understood that you intended to stay in the country no later than the 1st of December.
"That was my original intention."
He glanced down at her and pressed her fingers lightly where they rested on his arm.
"I have changed my plans. My sister Georgiana and my cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam are to join us at Netherfield before Christmas. I have charged Bingley to deliver the invitations to them while he is in London. Bingley confided that he hopes to marry Miss Bennet before the turn of the year, so we shall all be here for the wedding. It is now my hope that, in time, and with an opportunity to meet the best of my family, you shall come to think better of me."
Elizabeth was about to assure him that she already thought very much better of him, when something occurred to her. "But, Mr. Darcy, Georgiana cannot come to Netherfield. Mr. Wickham is in the neighbourhood." She kept her voice low, so that the others could not possibly hear her.
"He will be gone long before she arrives," Mr. Darcy said grimly. "I had a few words with Colonel Forster and with his second-in-command Carter last night, and I stopped by to see them this morning before coming here. A few queries among his fellow officers have revealed he already owes more than 2 years' worth of his salary in gaming debts, and one of them has accused him of cheating at cards. His letters of reference are being investigated, and I have no doubt that at least one of them is false. It is purported to be signed by my cousin the Colonel," he replied to Elizabeth's inquiring glance, "and as Richard would rather run Wickham through with a sword than wield a pen for him, my cousin's arrival will signify a very significant change in Mr. Wickham's fortunes. For my dear father's sake, I have offered Mr. Wickham a choice. He can accept military justice for his falsified reference, and then be sent to debtor's prison once that is dealt with, or he can accept £100 and a one-way ticket to the Americas, and I will settle his debts here."
"Did he accept your offer? It is surely more than he deserves, considering what he has done."
"I have to admit I am not sure," Mr. Darcy said serenely. "He was too busy picking his teeth up off the floor after he insulted my sister's honour. A few days in jail to think about it until my cousin arrives will see him arrive at the right decision, I am certain."
He flexed his right hand with a satisfied smile. For a moment Elizabeth stared at him speechless, and then she began to laugh. The merry chimes of her laughter floated on the still, cold air, and in front of them Mr. Hutton and Mary turned to look back. Mr. Hutton grinned at his friend, and then tugged lightly on Mary's arm, drawing her forward once again. As they walked around the side of the house, Elizabeth saw Mr. Collins' chaise pulling away, the man himself sitting rigidly inside, his face turned firmly away from Longbourn. "Good riddance," she murmured. Mr. Darcy heard her, saw the direction of her glance, and smiled in agreement. They returned to the parlour after a half-hour, slightly chilled, and were pleased to find the fire well built up and hot tea waiting, with some delicious cakes.
The two gentlemen partook eagerly. Elizabeth could not imagine what her aunt might have said to her mother, but Mrs. Bennet was everything gracious and charming to both their guests, and while she was quite insistent that they come to dinner the following night, she did not embarrass either of her daughters in the least. Both Mr. Darcy and Mr. Hutton were happy to accept the invitation, and Mr. Hutton stated that he was finding Netherfield so pleasant, and the Hertfordshire society so welcoming and congenial, that he was resolved to stay a good deal longer than the week he had originally planned.
"I was going to go back to Yorkshire for Christmas," he said, "but in truth there is nothing for me there. I should much rather stay here with my friends old and new."
He smiled happily at Mary, who blushed and looked down at her hands, a pleased little smile curving her lips.
"Bingley and I are always delighted to have you with us," Darcy said, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "And I know he has already invited you to stay as long as you please. The local society will certainly welcome your presence, will they not, Mrs. Bennet?"
"Any friend of Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy is very welcome in this house, of course," Mrs. Bennet said, "and no doubt in every house in the county."
It was a long time since Elizabeth had felt proud of her mother and not embarrassed by her. But in that moment she was very impressed by Mrs. Bennet's gracious charm as a hostess, and thought that she still had a few things to learn herself, watching her mother expertly prepare another cup of tea for their guests, and press them to try a slice of cook's fruit-cake. Of course, once the gentlemen had departed, with promises to return the following day to dine, Mrs. Bennet could not restrain her enthusiasm, but no one begrudged her excitement. It was Jane who innocently set the cat among the pigeons later that afternoon, when they all sat industriously stitching near the fire. Mrs. Gardner was gently teasing Mary about Mr. Hutton's attentions, and Jane looked up curiously.
"Really, Mary? Well, you shall be very grand." "What do you mean, Jane?" Elizabeth asked. "Why, Mr. Bingley told me that Mr. Hutton has a very nice estate called Hutton Bonville in North Yorkshire, which brings in a clear 3,000 a year. But that is the least of his prospects, for Mr. Hutton is the only heir of his great-uncle, the Earl of Leicester."
Mrs. Bennet screeched and nigh on swooned, and Mary's eyes rolled back in her head. Smelling salts were required for both of them, and the rest of the evening was spent in calming one's effusions and the other's panic.
"I cannot imagine why Mr. Darcy should introduce a friend as wealthy and important as Mr. Hutton to our family, Jane," Elizabeth said as they readied for bed. "And to Mary, of all people."
"Perhaps he felt that they would suit." Jane shrugged.
"Mr. Hutton does seem terribly shy with that stammer, and not at all self-important. I thought him very pleasant, though rather serious, and of quite a similar turn of mind to Mary, actually."
She turned to face Elizabeth, one eyebrow lifted, in an expression Elizabeth knew she herself often wore, but rarely saw on Jane.
"Can you not imagine why Mr. Darcy should want to help our family improve its connections, Lizzy? Can you really not?"
Elizabeth said no more, only blew out the candle and buried her hot cheeks in the pillows, too confused to know what to think. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Hutton indeed came the following day, quite early for a dinner appointment, but Elizabeth and Mary were pleased to walk with them again. Jane and Kitty came down at dinner-time and sat at table with them, but Lydia was nowhere to be seen. Elizabeth glanced at her mother curiously, but Mrs. Bennet only shook her head, and afterwards murmured to Elizabeth that she felt it best that Lydia should be confined above stairs until she showed genuine remorse and a willingness to truly apologise for her actions. Elizabeth could only look at her aunt in grateful astonishment. How Mrs. Gardner had persuaded Mrs. Bennet to finally take a firm hand with Lydia, she could not imagine.
she could not know that it was her own remonstrances with her mother that had made Mrs. Bennet take a long look at her youngest daughter, and realise that Lydia was behaving in the most spoiled, childish manner imaginable, and that the last thing such behaviour warranted was further opportunity to expose herself in society. As such, Mrs. Bennet had declared Lydia should no longer be out until she had shown her family that she was capable of acting in a mature and responsible manner. Lydia sobbed, pleaded, and finally screamed her way into hysterics, but her mother was not to be moved. She sat placidly on Lydia's bed, and when Lydia finally stopped to draw in breath, said, "Well, that was a display worthy of a 5-year-old. When you are able to behave as though you are 15 instead of 5, perhaps I will consider you worthy of my attention. Until then, I am afraid it is off to the nursery with you." To Lydia's utter humiliation, her mother had indeed made her go to the nursery, and sent her up coddled eggs, bread, and a glass of milk for her dinner. She would have stormed downstairs to make a scene, except that Mrs. Bennet had installed their housekeeper Mrs. Hill by the door with a switch, with strict instructions to use it on Lydia's bottom if she should dare misbehave. Lydia had never been switched in her life, but she had heard that it hurt an awful lot, and the martial glint in Mrs. Hill's eyes convinced her to mind her manners, for fear the housekeeper would find an excuse to teach her a lesson. Mrs. Hill had borne a good deal from Lydia over the years, and she was just itching for Lydia to offer her a reason to give the spoilt little madam what she had coming. She was quite surprised when Lydia sat down, ate her dinner meekly, and asked what she should do when she had finished. Mrs. Hill debated telling Lydia that she must come down to the kitchen and wash the dishes, but decided that might be a step too far without first seeking permission from Mrs. Bennet. Instead, she pointed to the bookshelf. "I know well enough that you paid little enough attention to lessons in the years you spent in the schoolroom, miss. No doubt you can find something there to educate yourself and learn better what your parents expect of you." Lydia wanted to make a smart retort, but Mrs. Hill tapped the switch against the door frame meaningfully, and instead she went quietly to the bookshelf. Everything in it was boring, not a fashion magazine in sight. In the end, she grabbed the thinnest book, one on basic household management, and flounced back to her seat. Mrs. Hill muttered something about Lydia maybe learning something useful for once, but Lydia studiously ignored her. Instead, she opened the book and gazed at the pages, while her eyes filled slowly with tears. Chapter 9.
"Have you made your decision, Wickham?"
The filthy, bearded man sitting in the straw of the cell bore little resemblance to the suave soldier he had been just a few days earlier. He lifted his chin and spat at Darcy, but the spittle didn't even reach the barred door. Darcy, standing outside the cell, didn't flinch.
"It is, of course, entirely your choice. I'd recommend you consider my offer, though. I understand a few of your former comrades are quite keen to apply the lashes that military justice would require before you are dragged off to debtor's prison."
Wickham glared, his jaw working soundlessly. And then he saw, behind Darcy, the figure of a tall, slender woman, cloaked and hooded, her face in shadow.
"Georgiana," he croaked, "do not let him do this. You cared for me once."
Darcy laughed bitterly.
"Do you seriously think I would let my sister within 20 miles of you, Wickham? No, this is someone who has waited to see justice done for a long time. She feels I am being too merciful, but she has agreed to help you on your way, to ensure you do not have the chance to spread your lies about Georgiana here in England."
The woman stepped forward, drawing down her hood, and Wickham's breath expelled in a hiss as he recognised Madeline Gardner.
"You!" She smiled tightly at him.
"Hello again, Mr. Wickham. I'm ready to go, Darcy." She looked up at her cousin. "Have him loaded."
"Wait," Wickham choked out, panicking. "You offered me a choice. Don't let her take me. She'll have me killed." "My cousin has given me her word that she will see you onto the ship bound for the Americas safely. Your money will be held by the captain and handed over when you debark." Darcy shrugged. "Once you are there, Wickham, I don't care what you do. As long as you never darken England's shores again, you and I are done." They stared at each other in mutual hatred for a while, and then Wickham nodded, defeated. Darcy gestured, and a moment later his cell door was being unlocked, and he was being dragged out, still in his shackles, and loaded into a closed carriage. 2 armed soldiers sat on the other seat, watching him intently. Before the door closed, Wickham saw Darcy lifting Mrs. Gardiner's hand to his lips, before handing her up into a much finer carriage. A moment later, the 2 vehicles rumbled into motion, heading south towards London. They drove straight to the docks, and Wickham was hustled into a small, empty warehouse, unshackled, and handed some clean, if rather shabby, clothes. He put them on gladly, happy to be rid of his blood-stained rags, and followed the 2 soldiers out to the pier, where a large ship was tied up, evidently preparing to set sail. A pair of burly sailors came up, nodded to the soldiers, and took custody of Wickham. He went with them, aware of Mrs. Gardiner sitting in her carriage a little further down the pier, watching him, no doubt. Clearly, he wasn't going to be given any opportunity to escape, and Wickham took a deep breath and prepared himself to face his new life. He put on his new, close-mouthed smile, damned Darcy for knocking out his front teeth anyway, and walked up the gangway onto the ship. "Wait there," one of the sailors ordered gruffly, pointing to a coil of rope. "Captain will speak to you after we sail." Wickham was about to argue that he wanted to go below and see his bunk, but the sailor caressed a long knife sheathed at his side, and he thought better of it. He sat down instead on the coil of rope. The ship cast off not 30 minutes later, but it was some 3 hours after that, when they had escaped the River Thames and were sailing out into the open sea, when the captain came to speak with Wickham. "You're Wickham," he said tersely. "Yes, sir. Very nice to meet you." Wickham stood and offered his close-mouthed smile, speaking in as gentlemanly a manner as he could manage. "I have yet to learn. What fine ship is this, and for what port are we bound?" He was hoping for Jamaica. There had to be plenty of opportunities there, with bored plantation owners' wives. Or maybe New Orleans. He had heard good things about that city. "I have instructions to put you off at our first port of call, which is St. John's." Seeing Wickham's befuddled look, the captain smiled tightly. "Newfoundland." Wickham still looked none the wiser, so he elaborated further. "It's an island off Canada's east coast. Long way north. Bloody cold in the winter. We'll be dodging icebergs to get there, I dare say." "I didn't think the packet boats sailed to Canada in the winter," Wickham said, beginning to feel the first stirrings of dread. The captain cocked his head and gave a very slight smile. "Did you think this was a packet boat, Mr. Wickham? No, no. Those sail out of Falmouth for the Atlantic crossing. This is the Scarborough Star. She is owned by Bingley Shipping, and once we have deposited our cargo at various ports along our route, we will be collecting goods to return to England for Gardner imports. Every man on my ship works for Bingleys or Gardiners, Mr. Wickham. You'll want to be very careful aboard the good ship Scarborough Star." Left alone on the deck as the captain walked away, Wickham turned about and stared at the receding shores of England. He wondered briefly
if he would have a better chance of survival if he jumped now and tried to swim for shore. Better that than being thrown overboard in the middle of the Atlantic in the dead of night, he supposed. But the waves even now were grey and churning, and he never had learned to swim. In the end, he sat down on the coil of rope again. What else was there to do? Mr. Bingley returned to Netherfield after an absence of 6 days, and found, to his pleasure, that Mr. Hutton had stayed on, and was not at all inclined to leave. Darcy was absolutely delighted, as it meant the two of them had been able to spend their time occupied with male pursuits, which primarily involved avoiding Caroline Bingley as much as possible, and spending a goodly portion of every day at Longbourn. Fortunately, Caroline was blissfully unaware of this fact. She was annoyed enough that they went out every day riding or shooting. Mr. Hurst was too lazy to go with them, so she never knew that the two men would divert in Longbourn's direction directly they were out of sight of Netherfield. They rarely returned until dinner-time, and sometimes not even then, so she was greatly disgusted, and quite keen for her brother to encourage Mr. Hutton to leave, so she could have Darcy back to herself, as she put it. Mr. Bingley listened very patiently to his sister's tirade, silently thinking what a fool she was making of herself.
"Certainly not," he said at last, when she wound down. "It sounds like marvellous fun, and I am so glad I am back so that I can join in."
He was well aware of what Darcy and Hutton had really been up to, having received a letter from Jane just the previous day, in which she had mentioned, with amusement evident, that her sisters were being quite assiduously courted by his friends. Bingley thought it was a wonderful idea. Darcy was his closest friend, and Hutton was a wonderful chap. To have them as his brothers, as far as Bingley was concerned, would be the icing on the cake of his marriage to Miss Bennet. Now, if he could just find someone to take Caroline off his hands, preferably someone who lived really far away, Wales might do, or Ireland. "Charles? Charles, are you listening to me?"
"Cornwall."
"What?"
Never mind," Bingley said hastily. "Sorry, Caroline. I did tell you that you would be bored here if you insisted on coming," he tried to placate her. "I told you Darcy and I planned to use the house as a hunting lodge."
Caroline huffed. "Ghastly place! A hunting lodge is all it is fit for. I can't imagine why you'd want to buy it."
"I don't plan to buy it. I have a 6-month lease, Caroline, and I dare say I shall not renew. While I greatly enjoy the society hereabouts, and I shall always be fond of Netherfield, because it was while living here that I met my dear Jane, it's not the kind of estate that will suit us. Hutton has told me about a very nice place he knows of for sale in the West Riding. I intend to go and look at it in the spring."
Caroline let out a little scream. "Yorkshire?"
"That's where the West Riding is, yes."
"But that's in the north." Bingley cocked his head at her.
"So is Derbyshire," he pointed out. "But I've not yet heard you complain of Pemberley's location."
Caroline was too upset at the thought of being dragged off to live in the wilds of the north to think of a suitable retort for that, and by the time she had finally come up with one, Bingley was gone. He ordered his horse saddled and headed out, glad that he no longer needed an excuse to make directly for Longbourn. Jane's reaction when he was shown into the parlour was everything he might have hoped. Her smile lit up the room, and her eyes sparkled as she gazed at him. Bingley crossed the room to her, seized her hand in his, and kissed it.
"I have missed you very much," he told her softly.
"I missed you too," Jane said, gazing her fill of him. He looked very handsome, with his curly blonde hair ruffled by the wind. "I have been kept busy, though, chaperoning my sisters."
"Indeed?"
Bingley took his eyes from her for a few moments and glanced around the room.
Mr. Hutton and Mary were at the table together, heads bent over some old tome. Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth sat by the window, a chessboard set up between them. Jane, sitting by the fire with her needlework, was indeed obviously there in the role of chaperone. Mr. Bingley looked at her and gave her a slightly roguish smile.
"But who will chaperone you and I, Miss Bennet?"
"I heard that, Mr. Bingley," Elizabeth called from her seat, though she did not take her eyes from the chessboard. "Behave yourself." He laughed, not at all abashed, and went about the room greeting everyone exuberantly, saying how happy he was to be back.
"Your business is all concluded?" Darcy asked. "Yes, yes. The Scarborough Star sailed the day before yesterday."
Bingley gave Darcy a reassuring nod.
"All her cargo well settled aboard."
He glanced across at Mr. Hutton and then at Darcy, and turned back to Jane, grinning mischievously.
"Miss Bennet, I must ask you, what is it that your mother puts in the tea here at Longbourn? I can think of no other explanation as to why your house has broken out in such a rash of lovesick fellows."
Elizabeth burst out laughing. "Mr. Bingley, if my mother indeed knew of such a secret ingredient for tea, we would all be dowered like royalty." Hutton and Darcy were both looking abashed, but not at all offended, and even Mary was smiling. Jane rang the bell to call for tea, and Bingley drew up a chair to sit beside her. Jane laid aside her needlework to give him her full attention, and he could not have been happier. Their peace was shattered not 5 minutes later, when the sound of a coach was heard coming up the drive. Elizabeth peered from the window. "That is a very grand equipage, but I do not recognise it. I wonder, to whom can it belong?" Mr. Darcy turned his head to look out too, and a moment later shot to his feet, pale-faced.
"That is my aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh."
Chapter 10. "Whatever can she want here?" Elizabeth asked, bemused, following Darcy out into the hall. He turned and took her hands in his. She blushed, still unaccustomed to such intimacy, even though he had approached her father to request a formal courtship 3 days ago, and had been much in her company since.
"My suspicion is that Mr. Collins ran straight home to Kent, with his tail between his legs, and poured out his tale of woe to Lady Catherine, including a selection of snippets about my interest in you that would have been like presenting a red cloak to a bull. I have already told you that I am bound by neither honour nor inclination to my cousin Anne. Lady Catherine has deluded herself for years that I will come about and marry her. To avoid the breach in the family which would ensue if I refused outright, I have never yet done so."
Elizabeth pursed her lips. "And now those chickens are coming home to roost?"
"They are, with a vengeance, on Longbourn's doorstep. I would rather the coming confrontation happen anywhere but here, but there is no way to avoid it now. All I ask, dearest Elizabeth, is that you leave me to face it alone. You need not be inflicted with the venomous spite she will spew upon you and your family."
"I will not." She lifted her chin proudly. "My courage rises with every attempt to intimidate me. Words cannot hurt me, for I am clad in the armour of knowing you love me." He said no more, for Hill was opening the door to admit Lady Catherine, but the look he bestowed on Elizabeth made her feel quite warm through. Side by side, they waited for the aggressor. Elizabeth was rather surprised to see that Lady Catherine de Bourgh was quite a small lady, no taller than she herself. She held a cane in her hand, but it seemed to be an affectation, for the tip never touched the ground. Instead, she used it to point with, and to punctuate her statements, which were delivered with all the force she could muster. Darcy deftly managed to escort Lady Catherine into the drawing-room, at which she looked around and sniffed dismissively, before settling her beady black eyes on Elizabeth, pointing her cane and saying,
"This, then, is the chit who thinks herself above being a parson's wife, who has refused a life of comfort and ease under my patronage, to reach far above herself and attempt to enter a sphere to which she will never be admitted. Darcy, I thought better of you than to be taken in by some adventuress. Pretty enough, I'll grant you, but you can surely enjoy her favours without having to sign the register for them."
"That is quite enough, madam," Darcy said sharply. "You will not insult Miss Elizabeth again. Do I make myself clear?"
"Only if you will give me your promise never to become engaged to her."
"I can offer no such promise. Should Miss Elizabeth ever deign to accept my hand, I would count myself the most fortunate of men." Lady Catherine, seeing that he was not to be moved, turned on Elizabeth.
"And you! You will ruin him, miss. Do you understand me? None of our family will acknowledge you. Darcy's former friends will cross the street to avoid you both. Pemberley will be desolate of good society."
Here she broke off, as Darcy had plucked from her hand the cane, which was jabbing, in his opinion, dangerously close to Elizabeth's chest. "What a crock of nonsense," he said sharply. "My two best friends sit in another room of this house at this very moment, courting two of Miss Elizabeth's sisters. As for my family, the only one who is unlikely to accept gladly my marrying someone who will make me happy is you yourself."
"What use is happiness?" Lady Catherine sneered. "You and Anne will have Rosings and Pemberley, a uniting of two great estates, noble bloodlines."
"And without happiness, those things would be as ashes." Elizabeth spoke for the first time. "Are you so unhappy, Lady Catherine, that you cannot bear to see anyone else find joy?"
"I did not give you leave to speak," Lady Catherine snapped.
"I did not give you leave to insult me in my own home."
"How dare you, miss? You insolent slattern!"
"Enough!" Darcy bellowed, and seizing Lady Catherine by the arm, he almost dragged her from the house. "Begone!" he ordered her sharply. "And do not trouble me again until you are ready to apologize. Be warned that if you dare to slander Miss Elizabeth again, I will let the truth you have hidden for so long be known." He held Lady Catherine's eyes for a long moment, until she wilted and looked away. She climbed into her carriage with not another word, but many furious glares. Darcy led Elizabeth back inside before the carriage was even halfway down the drive. She was itching to ask him what truth Lady Catherine had hidden. He could see it in her face. And so, before they re-entered the parlour, he said quietly, "My cousin Anne is not Sir Louis de Bourgh's daughter. For many years that marriage was childless. My father discovered that Anne was actually conceived at Pemberley, in an illicit liaison with another house-guest. Lady Catherine passed the child off as her husband's, and he never denied it, but it could not possibly have been true. Father left me a letter with documented proof, in case I should ever have need of thwarting Lady Catherine. There are quite a number of de Bourgh cousins who would have her out of Rosings in a moment, if they could ever prove Anne was not the true heir."
"Would you really have exposed her?"
"No. Well, Lady Catherine perhaps, but not Anne. Anne has consumption. She is unlikely to live longer than a few years more, and then her cousins will quibble over Rosings like a dog with a bone anyway. Even if Anne married, she would have to have a child to inherit from her. Her husband would not gain the estate if she died childless. Lady Catherine wanted me to marry Anne so that she could keep Rosings for Anne's lifetime, and then remove to Pemberley, which she has always coveted, following Anne's death."
"She must be deeply unhappy," Elizabeth said sadly, and Darcy smiled down at her,
and glanced around the hall to check that they were alone.
"Even after she insulted you so grievously, you are still kind to her. You are the true lady."
And he bent his head and brushed his lips lightly over hers. It was a rather delightful experience being kissed by Mr Darcy, Elizabeth found, and she swayed towards him unconsciously, lifting her hands to his chest to steady herself. A moment later she was in his arms and being kissed a good deal more thoroughly. Neither of them heard the book-room door open, nor even Mr Bennet's cough.
"Excuse me,"
Mr Bennet said, rather loudly, after 2 coughs and a loud clearing of his throat. Darcy and Elizabeth jumped apart, both red-faced.
"I know courtship these days might be considered to offer a gentleman a little more leeway in his actions, but not with one of my daughters, Mr Darcy."
"Sir," was all Darcy could manage. Elizabeth, unable to look at her father, hastily opened the parlour door and stepped inside, only to stop, her hands to her mouth, as she took in the scene before her. Both couples remaining in the parlour had their backs to the other. Mr Hutton and Mary were still at the table, but he had one of his hands placed firmly over hers on their book, and his other hand was at her cheek, twining a dangling curl around his fingers. His eyes were fixed firmly on Mary's blushing face, a smile curving his mouth, as she looked shyly back at him. Jane and Mr Bingley, by the fireside, were leaning into each other, kissing quite as passionately as Elizabeth and Mr Darcy had been but a few moments before.
"So," said Mr Bennet,
as everyone sprang apart and stared at him,
"who is going to be first?"
And so, one bright winter morning just after Christmas, there was a triple wedding at Longbourn Church. Mrs Bennet had bemoaned the limited amount of time to prepare 3 trousseaux, but all of her future sons had assured her that they planned to take their brides to be outfitted at the finest modistes London could offer. As Mrs Gardner had promised that they should have only the very best fabrics from Gardner imports also, Mrs Bennet was quite satisfied with writing long lists of the things they would need and passing them on to her sister. She herself intended to be quite busy at Longbourn, supervising Kitty and Lydia's further education. Mr Darcy had suggested that the 2 younger Bennet girls might like to share a season in town with his sister Georgiana, when she was presented the following year. Georgiana had taken at once to the friendly Kitty and lively Lydia, having few friends her own age, and they were in awe of her accomplishments, her natural grace, and her very expensive wardrobe. Meeting Georgiana had made Mrs Bennet realise just how very far Kitty and Lydia had still to go before they might be truly considered gentlewomen, and she had thrown herself into the endeavour with great purpose. As Elizabeth had predicted, all that was required was for Mrs Bennet to indicate her disapproval, and Lydia fell into line, with Kitty following along as always. Mrs Gardner watched, teary-eyed, as her 3 nieces walked the aisle, one at a time, their father returning to the back of the church each time to collect a daughter and lead her to her groom. The 3 young men looked nervous but happy. Mr Bingley beamed throughout the service, as did Jane. Their smiles betokened a long and contented life together, Mrs Gardner was sure, especially if Mr Bingley kept his resolve where that sister of his was concerned, and refused to allow her to live with them. Caroline Bingley sat in the pew across the church from Mrs Gardner, her eyes closed, seemingly unable to bear the sight of the happy couples standing before the altar. Madeline Gardner smiled to herself. She had already given Jane a few tips on how to ensure that Mr Bingley would always put his wife's wishes first. Her eldest niece was a quiet girl, but not a silly one, and she had listened carefully. Mr Darcy and Elizabeth smiled less, but their eyes were full of secret knowledge as they spoke their vows, each in clear, steady voices. They were entering into this marriage with their eyes wide open,
in full knowledge that neither of them was perfect. They were strong characters, and there would be moments of strife along the way, no doubt, but their love for each other would see them through the bad times as well as the good. Mr. Hutton stammered even more than usual saying his vows, but Mary stood with no sign of impatience and a gentle smile on her face. He clutched her hands and managed in the end, and no one doubted his sincerity. Mary would be good for him, Madeline thought, and he for her, and as far as she knew, the Earl of Leicester was in excellent health, so the girl should have years in which to learn the duties of a countess.
"You are smiling far too smugly, my matchmaking wife," a low voice murmured in her ear, and she turned to smile at her husband, her darling Edward. Jane Bennet took after her uncle, and he was as tall, blonde, blue-eyed and handsome now as he had been when they first met 11 years ago, Madeline thought, in the dark days after Louise's tragedy and her father's untimely death.
"I am just glad to see them so well settled," she said.
"And you think that your precipitous trip to Longbourn a month ago might have helped to bring this about?"
Edward Gardner crooked an eyebrow, much as Elizabeth might have done. Madeline smiled as her husband put his arm out for her to take, following the newlyweds out of the church. "Perhaps." Epilogue. Gracechurch Street, April 7th, 1812. My dearest Mrs. Darcy, oh, how well that sounds! I am so pleased to be able to write that, knowing that is forevermore your name. Darling Lizzy, I know by now you will have reached Pemberley, and will have seen that none of my descriptions have been in the slightest bit exaggerated. Have you ever seen a place so beautiful, for which nature has done more, or natural beauty been so little counteracted by awkward taste? The spring flowers will be blooming all around the lake, and the woodland full of bird-song. You will get lost on the paths, though, if you do not take a guide, for they are very extensive. I am sure that Mr. Darcy will have thought of that already, and assigned a groundsman to follow you on your rambles. You looked so well when I saw you last at the Bingleys' supper party, I have to confess my suspicions that the spring flowers might not be the only thing blooming at Pemberley this year. You have been married these 3 months, and while it would be too early for the quickening, other signs might be in evidence. I know I discussed these things with you, Jane, and Mary before your marriage. I cannot think it fitting for girls to go entirely unaware into matrimony. If there are any questions you would like to ask me, I am at your disposal. Of course, if I am incorrect in my suspicions, ignore these ramblings entirely. How I look forward to seeing you this summer. Mr. Darcy promised me that he should teach you to drive a little phaeton and ponies by then, and you shall take me all around the lake and the boundary of the park, for it is 10 miles around, and too far even for you on foot, my Lizzy. How pleasant a time we shall all have together, though we shall be with you only 2 weeks, before going on to see Charles and Jane at Angel's Rest, and then to Hutton Bonville to visit with Mary and John. So much better than the Lakes, our original destination, though perhaps we might all go there together next year. Darcy seemed to think that you should both like that. Well, I have nearly filled my paper and must go now, my dear, though I know your husband would not for a moment begrudge paying for another page. I must write yet to Mary, and my afternoon is almost gone. Your uncle and cousins send their fondest love, and we look forward very much to seeing you in June. With my love, as always, your loving Aunt Madeline. Pemberley, April 12th, 1812. Dearest Aunt Madeline, what can I say but that you are, as always, correct in every particular? My husband and I both stand in awe of your perspicacity. Your loving niece, Elizabeth Darcy. You have been listening to The Best of Relations, a Pride and Prejudice variation by Catherine Bilson. Narrated by Catherine Bilson.
Copyright 2015. Audiobook production copyright 2021.
For more of my works, please visit my website at catherinebilson.com.